The higher you stand, the further you fall. And nobody in the history of the Imperium ever stood higher than the Sons of Horus. They were the Exvi Legion, the Emperor's own. The first among equals in a brotherhood of 20 legions created to conquer the galaxy, and the first, in fact, the legion that led more campaigns, won more victories, claimed more worlds, and earned more battle honors than any other force in the Great Crusade's history. Their Primarch was the Warmaster. Their armor was the color of the sea. Their reputation was the standard against which every other legion measured itself, and every other legion fell short. They were the best. This is not opinion. It is the assessment of the Emperor himself, who elevated the Lunar Wolves' Primarch above all his brothers, and gave him command of the entire crusade, because the Lunar Wolves' Primarch was the one son who could be trusted with that responsibility. The Exvi Legion was the tip of the spear, the edge of the blade, the point at which the Imperium's military capability was concentrated in its most effective form. And then they turned. The Sons of Horus betrayed the Emperor. They broke the Imperium in half. They led the most devastating civil war in human history, and they did it not from the margins but from the center, not as a disgruntled minor force whose rebellion could be contained, but as the galaxy's premier military formation, turning its unmatched capability against the civilization it had been built to protect. The Horus heresy is named for them, not for the chaos gods who engineered it, not for the word-bearers who planted the seed, not for the Emperor's children or the World Eaters or any of the other legions that fell, for the Sons of Horus, for the legion whose Primarch gave the rebellion his name, because the rebellion was his, and the responsibility was his, and the galaxy's worst moment belongs to the being who made it possible. This is the story of how the best became the worst. How the Emperor's most trusted son became his most terrible enemy. How a legion that embodied everything the Imperium aspired to became the instrument that nearly destroyed it. It is the story of Horus Lupercal, the Warmaster, the first found, the favored son, the being who stood at the Emperor's right hand, and who drove the knife into the Imperium's back with the same hand that had built it. It is the story of the fall, not a stumble, not a gradual decline that might have been arrested at any of 100 points along the way. A fall, vertical, catastrophic, total, from the pinnacle of everything the human species had achieved to the nadir of everything the human species could become. The Sons of Horus fell from a height that no one has reached since. The crater they left is still there. The Imperium has been standing in it for 10,000 years. Chthoniya was a world that had already been consumed when Horus arrived. Located in one of the closest star systems to Terra, close enough that non-warp-capable vessels could reach it, close enough that the world had been colonized and exploited since the earliest days of humanity's expansion into space. Chthoniya was a hive world whose hives had been built on top of mines, whose resources had been exhausted millennia before the Emperor's Great Crusade began. The planet's original wealth, the minerals, the rare elements, the geological bounty that had made it worth colonizing, was gone. What remained was the infrastructure that had been built to extract the wealth, the tunnels, the hab blocks, the industrial structures that the original colonists had constructed, and that the subsequent generations had continued to inhabit long after the economic purpose of the inhabitation had expired. Chthoniya was a world of tunnels, endless, deep, interconnected passages that extended into the planet's crust for kilometers, carved by mining operations that had run for centuries, and that had left behind a three-dimensional labyrinth of stone and metal and darkness. The surface was uninhabitable, or close enough to uninhabitable that the distinction was academic. The population lived underground, in the tunnels and the hab blocks and the makeshift structures that generations of inhabitants had constructed from the debris of the mining operations. The gangs ran Chthoniya, with no central authority, no functioning government, no external power interested in administering a world whose resources were exhausted. The tunnels of Chthoniya were governed by the law of violence. Gang lords controlled territories. Gang wars determined the borders. Gang culture, the specific combination of brutality, loyalty, charisma, and pragmatic ruthlessness that the tunnel warfare produced, shaped every aspect of Chthonian life. Into this, Horus fell. The Primarchs were scattered as infants, torn from the Emperor's laboratory by the Chaos Gods, and deposited across the galaxy on worlds that would shape them into the beings they would become. Horus's capsule landed on Chthoniya, or near it, close enough that the world claimed him. Unlike most Primarchs whose childhoods are documented in varying degrees of detail, Horus's early years on Chthoniya are obscured by contradictions and omissions that the subsequent histories have not resolved. What is known is that Horus grew up in the gangs. He fought. He led. He developed the combination of physical ferocity and personal charisma that Chthoniya's tunnel warfare rewarded, and that would later define his approach to both military command and political leadership. Chthoniya's gang culture was not subtle. It valued directness. It valued strength. It valued the ability to inspire loyalty in people whose default condition was suspicion. Because in the tunnels, the leader who could not hold his gang's loyalty was the leader who was replaced, violently, permanently, without the procedural niceties that more civilized societies employed. Leadership on Chthoniya was not inherited or appointed. It was earned through capability and maintained through the constant demonstration of that capability. This is important. Chthoniya's culture is the lens through which everything the Lunar Wolves became must be understood. The legion that Horus built, the military force that would become the Imperium's finest and then the Imperium's greatest enemy, was a Chthonian gang scaled up to galactic proportions. The values were the same. The loyalty structures were the same. The relationship between the leader and the led, personal, intense, based on proven capability rather than institutional authority, was the same. The Lunar Wolves were not the Ultramarines. They were not governed by doctrine, by the institutional hierarchies that Guilliman would later codify, by the impersonal mechanisms that allow large organizations to function without depending on the personality of their leader. The Lunar Wolves were governed by Horus, by his personal magnetism, by his demonstrated capability, by the force of his character that made every warrior in the Legion feel that they were fighting not for an institution, but for a person, and that the person was worth fighting for. This was the Legion's greatest strength and its fatal weakness. The same quality of personal loyalty that made the Lunar Wolves the most effective fighting force in the Great Crusade made them the most vulnerable to their Primarch's corruption. When Horus turned, the Lunar Wolves turned with him. Not because every warrior in the Legion independently decided that betraying the Emperor was correct, but because their loyalty was to Horus rather than to the Imperium. And when Horus and the Imperium diverged, the warriors followed the person, not the institution. The Emperor found Horus on Chthoniya in 801 M30, making Horus the first Primarch recovered during the Great Crusade. The meeting is poorly documented, contradicted by multiple accounts that the Imperium's historians have never reconciled. What is consistent is the outcome. Horus was given command of the Xvi Legion, the legion that had been fighting under Terran officers with gene seed derived from Horus's own genetics, and the legion that would, under Horus's command, become the most celebrated military force in the history of the human species. The Lunar Wolves and their Primarch were united. The galaxy would learn what the combination could achieve. And then the galaxy would learn what it could destroy. Before Horus, the Xvi Legion had already earned its name. The Lunar Wolves designation was not metaphorical. It was earned on Luna, Terra's moon, the first major military objective of the Great Crusade, the battle that demonstrated what the Emperor's new legions could do. The Xvi Legion's assault on the Selenite cults that controlled Luna was so ferocious, so utterly devastating in its speed and its violence, that the Selenites surrendered not because they were defeated, but because they were terrified. The records claim they begged the Emperor to call off his wolves. The name stuck. The Lunar Wolves. A designation that captured the Legion's essential character in 2 words: the moon they had conquered, and the predatory nature of the warriors who had conquered it. The name carried a quality of savagery that the Legion embraced rather than softened, because the savagery was honest. The Lunar Wolves were not diplomats. They were not administrators. They were the Emperor's killing edge. And the killing edge did not require a euphemistic name. The Legion's pre-Horus character was already formidable. The Terran recruits who comprised the original Xvi Legion had been shaped by the Unification Wars, the brutal campaigns that had brought Terra itself under the Emperor's control. And the shaping had produced warriors whose relationship to violence was professional rather than emotional. They fought because fighting was their function. They killed because killing was the means by which their function was fulfilled. The Xvi Legion under Terran command was effective, disciplined and unremarkable, one of 20 legions, distinguished from its peers by capability but not by character. Horus changed this. The Primarch's arrival on Chthoniya and his assumption of command transformed the Lunar Wolves from a competent military force into something qualitatively different. Horus did not simply lead the Legion. He infused it with his personality. The Chthonian recruits he brought in, the gang fighters, the tunnel warriors, the products of Chthoniya's violent meritocracy, blended with the Terran core to produce a legion whose culture reflected both sources, Terra's discipline and Chthoniya's ferocity, the Emperor's purpose and Horus's magnetism. The Lunar Wolves fought at the Emperor's side. This is the detail that distinguishes them from every other legion, and that explains both their elevation and their fall. During the early decades of the Great Crusade, while the other Primarchs were being found and united with their legions, Horus fought alongside the Emperor himself. Father and son, side by side, conquering the galaxy together. Horus learned from the Emperor directly, not through doctrine transmitted through intermediaries, not through institutional training programs, but through the intimate, personal, campaign-by-campaign experience of fighting the galaxy's wars alongside the being who had created him. This proximity produced knowledge that no other Primarch possessed. Horus understood the Emperor's methods. He understood the Emperor's thinking. He understood the nuances of command that the Emperor's approach to warfare involved, because he had observed them firsthand across decades of shared campaigning, in conditions that no briefing document could reproduce. The proximity also produced dependency. Horus's identity was built around his relationship with the Emperor. He was not simply a Primarch, he was the Emperor's son, the favored one, the being whose value was measured by his closeness to the being who had made him. When the Emperor withdrew, when he returned to Terra to pursue the project that would later be identified as the Imperial Webway, leaving the Great Crusade in the Primarch's hands, the withdrawal left a vacuum in Horus's sense of self that nothing else could fill. The Emperor left. Horus remained. And the gap between the two, between the Primarch who needed the Emperor's presence and the Emperor who had moved on to other things, became the crack through which the corruption would eventually enter. But that was later. In the golden age of the Great Crusade, the Lunar Wolves were magnificent. They conquered worlds with a speed and a decisiveness that no other legion could match. Horus's tactical acumen, the combination of Chthonian pragmatism and Emperor-taught strategy, produced victories that exceeded what the strategic assessments predicted. Time after time, campaign after campaign, decade after decade. The Lunar Wolves went for the throat. This was the doctrine that Horus developed and that the Legion adopted as its defining operational principle: identify the enemy's center of gravity, the command structure, the political leadership, the single point whose destruction would collapse the resistance, and strike it with overwhelming force, ignoring the peripheral defenses, bypassing the secondary objectives, driving straight for the thing that held the enemy together and removing it. The doctrine was brilliantly effective. A conventional army fights the enemy's army. The Lunar Wolves fought the enemy's will. The throat strike did not destroy the enemy's military capability, it destroyed the enemy's capacity to use it. A world whose political leadership had been decapitated in a single surgical assault did not have the coordination to resist the conventional operations that followed, and the conquest that might have taken months was accomplished in days. This approach was Chthonian to its core. On Chthonia, the gang war was won by killing the boss, not by grinding down the gang. The boss was the gang's cohesion. Remove the boss and the gang fragmented. Horus scaled this principle to galactic warfare with the ease of a being whose childhood education had been the Tunnel War and whose adult education had been the Great Crusade. The Lunar Wolves earned more compliance actions than any other legion, more worlds brought into the Imperium, more campaigns won, more of the Great Crusade's objectives achieved. They were, by every metric the Imperium used to measure military performance, the best. This is the height from which they fell. Not a modest elevation, not a respectable position in the middle ranks of the Astartes hierarchy. The pinnacle, the absolute summit of what a Space Marine Legion could be, achieved through decades of unmatched performance, validated by the Emperor's own assessment, recognized by every other legion as the standard they aspired to. The Lunar Wolves were the best. And the best's betrayal was the worst thing that could happen to the Imperium, because the capability that made them the best was the same capability that made their treachery devastating. Before the corruption, there was the man, or the being, the transhuman, the Primarch, the Emperor's son. But the word man is deliberately chosen, because Horus's most remarkable quality before Davin was his humanity. Not his physical capability, not his tactical genius, not the strategic brilliance that made him the Warmaster. His humanity, the quality of genuine, personal, emotionally engaged leadership that made every being who served under him feel that their service mattered to the being they were serving. Horus remembered names. This sounds trivial. It is not trivial. A Primarch commands a legion of tens of thousands of warriors, each of whom is individually a formidable combatant, each of whom has a history and a personality and a career that the Legion's records track, but that the Primarch's attention cannot reasonably encompass. Most Primarchs manage the relationship between themselves and their warriors through mechanisms. The formal hierarchy, the command structure, the impersonal systems that allow large organizations to function without the leader's personal engagement with every individual member. Horus remembered names. He knew his warriors. Not all of them, not the entire legion, but more of them than any other Primarch knew. He would stop a warrior in a corridor and ask about the wound the warrior had received 3 campaigns ago. He would remember the name of a sergeant's fallen brother and mention the brother with a casualness that transformed the mention from a formal acknowledgement into a personal one. He would fight alongside line warriors, not from the command position that most Primarchs occupied during engagements, not from the elevated vantage that a Primarch's capability permitted, but in the line, shoulder to shoulder, demonstrating through his presence that the Primarch did not consider himself above the warriors he led. This was calculated. The accusation is fair, and Horus would not have denied it. The personal touch, the remembered names, the presence in the line, these were not spontaneous expressions of affection. They were leadership tools, deployed with the deliberateness that Horus brought to every aspect of his command. The Warmaster understood that a warrior who believed his commander knew him personally was a warrior who would fight harder, endure longer, and obey more completely than a warrior who served an impersonal institution. But the pragmatism does not invalidate the affection. Horus loved his sons. The love was real, or as real as anything a Primarch's engineered psychology could produce. The warriors who served him were not abstractions. They were individuals whose lives and deaths carried weight in the Primarch's awareness, and the weight was not simulated. Horus grieved his dead. He celebrated his successful. He invested in the development of warriors who showed potential and mourned the loss of warriors whose potential was cut short. This is what made the betrayal so devastating. The warriors who followed Horus into treachery at Istvan III and beyond were not following an abstraction. They were following a being who had known their names and fought beside them and grieved their brothers' deaths. The loyalty that the corruption exploited was not institutional loyalty, not the impersonal obligation of a soldier to his commander. It was personal loyalty, the bond between a warrior and a leader who had earned the bond through the specific, individual, deliberate act of treating each warrior as a person rather than a unit. Horus's relationships with his brother Primarchs reflected the same quality. The Warmaster was the binding agent of the Primarch brotherhood, the brother who maintained relationships with all the others, who mediated disputes between the more fractious siblings, who provided the social cohesion that the brotherhood's diverse personalities required. Sanguinius loved him. Fulgrim admired him. Rogel Dawn respected him. Even the brothers who were difficult, Angron, Mortarion, Perturabo, responded to Horus's engagement with a tolerance they did not extend to most of their siblings. When Horus turned, the fracturing was not simply political. It was personal. The brothers who followed him into treachery, some of them at least, followed because they trusted Horus's judgment more than they trusted the Emperor's governance. And the trust was the product of decades of relationship building that Horus had conducted with the same deliberateness he brought to his military campaigns. The brothers who remained loyal were wounded by the betrayal in ways that the political rupture alone cannot explain. Sanguinius, who had urged Horus to rename the legion, who had maintained the closest fraternal bond with the Warmaster, carried the betrayal as a personal wound that the angel bore alongside the other burdens the heresy imposed. Dawn, who had respected the Warmaster's capability and who had built the palace's defenses against the being he had once considered the Imperium's finest commander, fought the siege with a fury that went past the military into the personal. The personal quality of Horus's leadership is the thread that connects every chapter of the Sons of Horus's story. The Lunar Wolves were built on it. The Great Crusade's success depended on it. The heresy exploited it. The Sons of Horus's collapse after the Warmaster's death was produced by it. The removal of the personal bond left nothing behind, because the bond was the thing, and the thing was gone. Horus was the most charismatic being the galaxy has produced. Not the most powerful. The Emperor exceeds him. Not the wisest. Several of his brothers surpassed him in specific domains. The most charismatic. The being whose personal magnetism transformed everyone he interacted with into someone who wanted to serve him, who believed in him, who would follow him through the gates of hell because the following felt like the right thing to do. The charisma was the weapon, not the bolter, not the world breaker, the massive power maul the Warmaster wielded in battle. Not the Chaos God's enhancement. The charisma, the ability to make people follow him. The quality that made the Lunar Wolves what they were, and that turned the Sons of Horus into the instrument of the galaxy's worst day. The tragedy is not that Horus fell. The tragedy is that the being who fell was worth following. The Mournival was the Lunar Wolves' most distinctive internal tradition, and its destruction was the first casualty of the heresy. 4 captains, selected not for rank or seniority but for temperament, each embodying one of the 4 humours that ancient Terran medicine had described as the governing forces of human emotion. The choleric, the sanguine, the phlegmatic, the melancholic. 4 dispositions, balanced against each other, providing the Primarch with a council of advisors whose combined perspectives covered the full range of human response to any situation the Legion might face. The Mournival was not a formal command structure. It had no authority in the Legion's chain of command, no official position in the order of battle, no institutional power that the Legion's regulations recognized. It was personal. It was Horus's, a group of warriors the Primarch trusted to tell him what he needed to hear rather than what he wanted to hear, whose function was not to agree with the Warmaster but to challenge him, to present the perspectives that his own thinking might miss, to ensure that the decisions he made were examined from every angle before the examination's conclusions became irreversible. Ezekiel Abaddon was the choleric, first captain of the First Company, commander of the Justarin Terminators, the Lunar Wolves' most elite formation, and the warrior whose temperament matched the designation with uncomfortable precision. Abaddon was aggressive, not in the casual way that many space marines are aggressive. not the general orientation toward violence that the gene seed and the training produce. Specifically, intensely, personally aggressive, with a directness that bypassed the diplomatic qualifications that most officers learn to employ, and that made Abaddon simultaneously the Mournival's most forceful voice and its least nuanced. Abaddon's loyalty to Horus was absolute. This is the fact that defines everything Abaddon was before the heresy and everything he became after it. The first captain's commitment to his Primarch exceeded his commitment to the Emperor, to the Imperium, to the Great Crusade itself. If Horus had asked Abaddon to walk into a star, Abaddon would have asked which star. The loyalty was not reasoned. It was not conditional. It was the product of the Thonian gang lord culture that Abaddon embodied more completely than any other officer in the Legion. The absolute, unquestioning devotion of the lieutenant to the boss, maintained not through institutional obligation but through personal bond. Tariq Torgadon was the sanguine second captain, and the Mournival's most human member, the warrior who joked, who laughed, who maintained the light-hearted disposition that the sanguine temperament prescribed, even in conditions that gave most warriors no reason to laugh. Torgadon's humor was not the forced cheerfulness of a being performing optimism for morale. It was genuine, the expression of a personality that found something to laugh about in most situations, that used humor as a lens for understanding the world, that made Torgadon the most relatable and the most beloved of the Mournival's members. Torgadon was also brave in a way that exceeded the standard Space Marine definition of bravery. He told Horus things Horus did not want to hear. He challenged the Primarchs' decisions when the decisions warranted challenge. He pushed back against the Mournival's other members when their counsel was wrong, with a directness that his humor made palatable, but that his conviction made sharp. Torgadon was the conscience, not formally, not in any designated role, but in the practical sense that his willingness to speak uncomfortable truths provided the Mournival with the quality of honest disagreement that an advisory body requires to function. Garviel Loken was the phlegmatic 10th captain, elevated to the Mournival after the death of Hasta Sejanus, the previous sanguine member, killed on the world designated 6319 during a diplomatic encounter that went wrong. Loken was rational, measured, analytical. The member whose contribution to the Mournival was the capacity to evaluate situations without the emotional charge that Abaddon's aggression and Torgadon's passion brought. Loken was also, critically, the outsider, elevated to the Mournival late, after the relationships between the other three had been established for decades. Loken brought the perspective of a warrior who was not fully enmeshed in the loyalties and the unspoken agreements that long service together produces. He saw things the others missed, not because he was more intelligent, but because he was less invested in the assumptions that familiarity generates. Loken became the heresy's most important witness. The warrior who watched the corruption happen from inside the inner circle, who recognized what was happening before the other members of the Mournival did, who tried to prevent the fall and failed and survived the failure, and carried the testimony into the subsequent history. Without Loken, the Imperium's understanding of how the Lunar Wolves fell would be significantly less detailed. Because Loken was the observer whose position inside the corruption's radius gave him the perspective that external observers could not achieve. Horus Aximand was the melancholic 5th captain, called Little Horus, because he resembled the Primarch so closely that the resemblance had become his defining characteristic. Aximand was thoughtful, brooding, possessed of a seriousness that balanced Torgadon's humour, and that the melancholic designation captured accurately. He was the member who worried, who saw the dangers that optimism obscured, who carried the weight of potential failure alongside the expectation of success. Aximan's tragedy was the Mournival's tragedy in miniature. He was not a monster. He was not a willing servant of chaos. He was a loyal warrior whose loyalty to his Primarch, the same Thonian personal, absolute loyalty that defined the entire Legion, placed him on the wrong side of a line that the Legion's culture had not prepared him to draw. When Horus turned, Aximan turned with him, not because Aximan believed in the treachery, but because Aximan believed in Horus, and the belief in Horus superseded the belief in everything else. The Mournival functioned because its four temperaments balanced each other. The choleric's aggression was tempered by the phlegmatic's reason. The sanguine's optimism was balanced by the melancholic's caution. The four perspectives, combined, produced a council that could evaluate any situation from every angle and provide the Primarch with advice that no single temperament could generate alone. When the heresy came, the balance shattered. Abaddon followed Horus into treachery without hesitation. Aximan followed reluctantly, dragged by loyalty past the line his judgment should have prevented him from crossing. Torgadon and Loken refused, recognized the corruption for what it was and stood against it, and the standing cost Torgadon his life and nearly cost Loken his. The Mournival's destruction was the heresy's first chapter. The advisory body that was supposed to prevent the Primarch from making catastrophic decisions was itself destroyed by the catastrophic decision, because the body's members were selected for loyalty to the Primarch, and the loyalty that qualified them for the Council was the loyalty that prevented them from opposing the Council's master. The system was designed to prevent exactly what happened. The system failed because the system's designers did not account for the possibility that the Primarch himself would be the threat the system needed to address. After the Great Crusade, the massed imperial assault that broke the largest orc empire the galaxy had produced, fought by multiple legions under Horus's overall command, the Emperor made the decision that would reshape the galaxy. He named Horus Warmaster. The title was new. No being had ever held it, no Primarch, no mortal commander, no authority below the Emperor himself had been given the supreme military command of the Great Crusade. The Warmaster would direct the crusade in the Emperor's absence, coordinating the legions, assigning objectives, managing the vast machinery of galactic conquest that the Emperor had built, and that the Emperor was about to step away from. Because the Emperor was leaving. Not leaving the galaxy, leaving the crusade. Returning to Terra to pursue a project that he did not fully explain to his sons. The project that would later be identified as the Imperial Webway. The attempt to build a human-controlled passage through the Imperium that would free humanity from dependence on the warp for interstellar travel. The project required the Emperor's full psychic attention, and the full attention meant that the Emperor could not continue to lead the crusade personally. Someone else would lead it. Horus was the obvious choice, the first found, the most celebrated, the Primarch whose record of victories exceeded every brother's. The Emperor's decision was logical, supported by the evidence, validated by every metric the Imperium used to assess military capability. The decision was also devastating. Horus received the title with a mixture of pride and unease that the histories record without fully explaining. The pride was obvious, the greatest honor the Imperium could bestow, given to the Primarch who had earned it through decades of unmatched performance. The unease was deeper. The Warmaster title placed Horus above his brother Primarchs, and the elevation produced a shift in the relationships between the sons of the Emperor that the elevation's architects had not fully anticipated. Some Primarchs accepted Horus's elevation. Sanguinius supported it. The Angel and the Warmaster maintained a bond that exceeded the ordinary fraternal competition between Primarchs. Jagatai Khan accepted it with the quiet pragmatism that defined the Khan's approach to most things. Fulgrim celebrated it, at least initially, with the enthusiasm that the Emperor's children's Primarch brought to any occasion that warranted celebration. Others did not accept it gracefully. Perturabo resented it. The Iron Warrior's Primarch's perpetual sense of being undervalued was intensified by the elevation of a brother he considered no more capable than himself. Angron barely registered it. The World Eater's Primarch's rage consumed most of his cognitive capacity for political nuance. Mortarion received the news with the sullen hostility that characterized his response to most things the Emperor decided. And the Emperor left. This is the moment. Not the corruption on Davin, not the betrayal at Istvan, not the siege of Terra. This is the moment the heresy became possible. The moment the Emperor walked away from his sons and left them to manage a galactic civilization without the presence that had held the civilization together. The Emperor did not explain why he was leaving. He did not tell his sons what the project on Terra involved. He simply informed them that the crusade would continue under Horus's direction and departed, and the departure left a gap in the Primarch's understanding of their purpose that the Chaos Gods would exploit with devastating effectiveness. Horus was left holding the galaxy. The Warmaster, newly elevated, newly responsible for a military enterprise of galactic scope, newly expected to coordinate brothers who did not all accept his authority, stood at the head of the Great Crusade and watched the Emperor's back as it receded toward Terra. The father had left the son in charge of the family business, and the son did not understand why the father was leaving. And the not understanding produced a vulnerability that was invisible to everyone except the beings who were looking for vulnerabilities to exploit. The death of Hastus Sejanus made the vulnerability worse. Sejanus was the fourth captain of the Lunar Wolves, a member of the Mournival, and Horus's most beloved son, the warrior whose relationship to the Primarch transcended the standard bond between commander and subordinate, and approached something closer to the bond between parent and child. Sejanus was killed on the world, designated 6319, cut down during a diplomatic encounter with a self-proclaimed emperor who took offense at the suggestion that there was another, true emperor of mankind. The death was not strategically significant. One captain, killed in one encounter, on one world among thousands, but the death was emotionally devastating. Because Horus's emotional investment in Sejanus exceeded his emotional investment in most of his other sons, and the loss opened a wound in the Primarch's psyche that would not heal. This is the crack. The emotional vulnerability that Sejanus's death produced, the grief, the anger, the quality of loss that the death of a beloved subordinate creates in a leader who does not have the emotional reserves to process it, was the crack through which the corruption would enter. Not through the crack alone. The corruption required additional mechanisms, the warrior lodges, Erebus's manipulation, the blade on Davin. But the crack was necessary. Without it, the additional mechanisms would not have had a surface to work on. Horus was grieving. Horus was isolated. Horus was carrying a burden the Emperor had placed on him without explanation, surrounded by brothers who did not all support his authority, mourning a son whose death had opened a wound he could not close. The Chaos Gods were watching. They had been watching for a long time, with the patience of entities who measured time in eons, and they recognized the moment, the specific convergence of grief and isolation and burden that made the galaxy's most powerful Primarch vulnerable to the approach that would change everything. The approach was already in motion. Erebus, the first chaplain of the Word-Bearers, the agent of Lorgar's vengeance, the instrument through which the Word-Bearers' fury at the Emperor's censure would be directed at the Imperium itself, had already been placed near Horus. The plan was Lorgar's, the execution was Erebus's, and the target was the Warmaster. The trap was set on a world called Davin. Behind every great commander stands the officer who manages the details the commander's attention does not reach. And behind Horus Lupercal stood Malagurst. Malagurst the Twisted, the Warmaster's equerry, the administrative officer whose function was the management of the Sons of Horus's apparatus, while the Warmaster directed the military operations that the apparatus supported. The title equerry understates the role's significance. Malagurst did not simply manage Horus's schedule or coordinate his meetings. He ran the Legion, not the military operations. Those were the Mournival's province and ultimately the Warmaster's. The administrative machinery, the logistics, the communications, the political relationships with other legions and with the Imperium's mortal institutions. The 1,000 daily decisions that a legion-sized military force generates, and that the Primarch's attention cannot individually address. The name Twisted was earned honestly. Malagurst's body was damaged, broken in a battle that the Legion's apothecaries could not fully repair, leaving the equerry with a physical deformity that prevented him from fighting in the front lines, and that redirected his considerable capability toward the administrative functions that the deformity made him available for. The twisting was physical. The mind behind the twisted body was razor sharp, and the sharpness made Malagurst one of the most effective managers the Sons of Horus produced. During the Great Crusade, Malagurst's function was straightforward: manage the Legion's non-combat operations with the efficiency that the Warmaster's standards demanded. The function was performed with a competence that Horus valued, and that the Legion depended on without always recognizing the dependence. Because the nature of effective administrative management is that the managed do not notice the managing until it stops. During the heresy, Malagurst's function changed. The equerry became the Warmaster's political officer, the being who managed the relationships between the Sons of Horus and the other traitor legions, who coordinated the rebellion's logistics across a galactic front, who maintained the cohesion that the heresy's internal politics constantly threatened to fracture. The role required the same administrative skill that the Great Crusade had demanded, applied to conditions that the Great Crusade's relatively stable politics had not produced. The traitor coalition was not unified. The 8 Primarchs who had joined Horus's rebellion were not united by a common purpose. They were united by a common enemy. And the distinction between the two is the distinction between an alliance and a mob. And the distinction produced the institutional friction that Malagurst was responsible for managing. Perturabo wanted recognition, Angron wanted blood, Mortarion wanted vengeance, Fulgrim wanted sensation, Lorgar wanted theological validation. Each Primarch's purpose was different, and each purpose produced demands on the rebellion's resources that the rebellion's logistics had to accommodate. Malagast accommodated them. The equerry's skill in managing the diverse, contradictory, frequently hostile demands of the traitor Primarchs was one of the heresy's unheralded enablers. Without Malagast's management of the coalition's politics, the rebellion might have fractured long before it reached terror, consumed by the internal contradictions that 8 different Primarchs' 8 different agendas produced. When Horus's condition deteriorated during the siege, when the Warmaster withdrew into his chambers aboard the Vengeful Spirit, consumed by the Chaos God's corrosive influence, increasingly unable to direct the campaign he had started, Malagast attempted to maintain the fiction of the Warmaster's involvement. The equerry issued orders in Horus's name, maintained the appearance of the Warmaster's engagement with the siege's operations, and attempted to prevent the other traitor forces from recognizing that the being they were following was no longer capable of leading. The fiction failed. Malagast's administrative skill, however formidable, could not substitute for the Warmaster's personal authority, and the authority's absence was visible to the Primarchs whose cooperation the authority had maintained. The siege's coordination degraded. The traitor forces pursued individual objectives rather than the collective purpose that Horus's leadership should have provided. The siege's failure is attributable to many causes, but the absence of effective command, the gap that Horus's deterioration produced, and that Malagast's best efforts could not fill, is among the most significant. Malagast died during the siege. The equerry who had held the legion together through the Great Crusade and the heresy did not survive to see the consequences of the failure he had been unable to prevent. His death removed the last institutional manager who understood the Sons of Horus's administrative machinery, and the removal contributed to the collapse that followed Horus's death. The twisted, the broken-bodied, sharp-minded officer who managed the details while the Warmaster managed the strategy, the being whose contribution to the Sons of Horus's effectiveness was invisible because effectiveness was what the contribution produced, and the produced thing was noticed while the producing was not. In the Sons of Horus's history, Malagast occupies the position that institutional managers always occupy: essential, undervalued, remembered only when the absence reveals what the presence provided. The Sons of Horus's collapse after Horus's death was not simply the result of the Primarch's loss. It was the result of the loss of every institutional mechanism that the Primarch's leadership depended on. The Mournival destroyed at Istvan III, the equerry killed during the siege, the command protocols that the Chthonian loyalty culture had embedded in the Legion's functioning. Each loss removed a component that the Legion needed to function. The cumulative removal produced a force that could not function, and the inability to function was the Sons of Horus's end. Malagast understood this. The equerry whose job was to understand how institutions function and how they fail understood, in his final days, that the institution he had spent his career maintaining was beyond maintenance. The Sons of Horus were dying, and the dying was not the kind that the apothecaries could treat, because the dying was institutional rather than biological. The progressive failure of the systems that held the Legion together, consumed by the same forces that had consumed the Primarch those systems were built around. The Twisted died knowing what was coming. The knowing was itself a kind of death, preceding the physical one, the awareness that the thing you have spent your life maintaining is going to collapse, and that the collapse is beyond your ability to prevent. The Sons of Horus's last institutional officer died during the Siege of Terra. The institution followed him shortly afterward. Davin was a feral world that the Lunar Wolves had brought into compliance years earlier, in a campaign conducted alongside the Word-Bearers. The world was unremarkable, a low-technology civilization, easily compliant, assigned an imperial governor and left to develop under the Imperium's standard governance structure. The governor, Yugen Temba, had been a reliable administrator, and then Temba had rebelled. The rebellion was not organic. It was manufactured, engineered by Erebus, who had cultivated the conditions on Davin's moon that would produce the crisis the corruption plan required. Temba had been exposed to chaos, specifically to the influence of Nurgle, the plague god, whose corruption had transformed the planetary governor from a competent administrator into a puppet of the ruinous powers. The rebellion was bait. The crisis that the rebellion produced, the need for the Warmaster to respond personally, to bring the Sons of Horus to Davin's moon and address the insurrection, was the mechanism by which Horus would be brought to the place where the corruption would occur. Erebus had prepared the trap. The Word-Bearer's first chaplain had stolen an artifact during the Sons of Horus's recent encounter with the Interrex, a sophisticated human civilization that had maintained knowledge of chaos across the millennia, and that had been in the process of establishing diplomatic relations with the Warmaster's forces. The artifact was the Kinabrak Anathame, a blade of alien manufacture, sacred to Nurgle, imbued with the plague god's corruption. Erebus had stolen it during the Sons of Horus's visit to the Interrex world of Zenobia, and the theft had sabotaged the diplomatic process and ensured that the Interrex, a civilization that could have provided the Imperium with crucial knowledge about the nature of chaos, became an enemy instead of an ally. The anatheme was given to Temba, the corrupted governor, now a bloated, plague-ridden shell animated by Nurgle's power, confronted Horus on Davin's moon and struck him with the blade. The wound was terrible, not simply in the physical sense, though the damage to Horus's body was severe. The anatheme's corruption entered the Primarchs' system, carrying Nurgle's taint into the superhuman biology that the Emperor's genecraft had produced. The wound would not heal. The poison spread. Horus collapsed. The Lunar Wolves' apothecaries could not treat the wound. The Primarch's biology, designed to resist any conventional pathology, capable of regenerating from damage that would kill any lesser being, could not overcome the supernatural corruption that the anatheme had introduced. Horus was dying, not from the wound, from the corruption. Erebus offered a solution. The Serpent Lodge, a local Davinite cult, descended from the totem animal worship that the world's native culture practiced, had healers who could treat the Warmaster's condition. The suggestion was presented to the Mournival, and the Mournival was divided. Loken opposed it, the rational member, the phlegmatic, whose instincts told him that the Serpent Lodge was not what it appeared to be. Abaddon supported it, the choleric, desperate to save his Primarch, willing to accept any solution that offered hope regardless of its provenance. Abaddon's position prevailed. Horus was delivered into the Serpent Lodge's care. What happened inside the lodge was not medicine. It was a ritual. A chaos ritual, conducted by sorcerers whose connection to the warp was deeper than the crude totemism their culture's surface presented, whose actual purpose was not to heal the Warmaster's body, but to deliver the Warmaster's spirit into the warp, into the Imperium, where the chaos gods could speak to him directly. Horus's spirit entered the warp, and in the warp he was shown visions. The visions were Erebus's. The word-bearer's agent appeared to Horus in the guise of Hasta Sejanus, the dead son, the beloved captain, the wound that had never healed. The appearance was calculated. Erebus knew that Horus's grief for Sejanus was the vulnerability, and the vulnerability was the door through which the vision's message could be delivered. The message was this: the Emperor had betrayed the Primarchs. The Great Crusade, the project the Emperor had built, the galaxy-spanning campaign the Primarchs had fought to complete, was not what it appeared. The Emperor did not intend for the Primarchs to share in the Imperium he was building. The Emperor intended to discard them, as he had discarded the Thunder Warriors before them, the soldiers who had fought the Unification Wars, and who had been eliminated when their usefulness expired. The vision showed Horus a future, a galaxy in which the Emperor was worshipped as a god, enthroned in divinity, served by priests who offered prayers to his image, while the Primarchs who had conquered the galaxy for him were forgotten. The Space Marines who had bled for the Imperium were reduced to ceremonial guards. The beings the Emperor had created to be his sons were treated as tools, used when useful, discarded when not. The vision showed Horus the Emperor's secret project. The Webway, the Immaterium passage that the Emperor was building beneath the Imperial Palace on Terra, was revealed as the true reason for the Emperor's withdrawal from the Crusade. The Emperor had not left because he trusted Horus to lead in his absence. He had left because the project was more important than the Crusade, and the Crusade and the Primarchs who fought it were means to an end that the Emperor had not shared with his sons. The vision showed Horus the hypocrisy. The Emperor had forbidden sorcery, had denounced the use of the warp's energies, had censured the word-bearers for their worship of him as a god, and yet the Emperor's own works depended on the same warp-based power he had forbidden to everyone else. The Imperial Webway was a warp construct. The Primarchs themselves had been created through processes that involved the warp. The Emperor's prohibition of sorcery was not a moral principle. It was a monopoly. Whether the visions were true is one of the most debated questions in the heresy's historiography. Some of what the vision showed was accurate. The Emperor was indeed building the Webway. The Emperor had indeed used warp-derived processes in the Primarch's creation. The Emperor had indeed failed to share the project's details with his sons. Some of what the vision showed was fabricated. The future in which the Emperor was worshipped as a god was, at the time of the vision, a chaos-generated projection rather than a confirmed future. And the suggestion that the Emperor intended to discard the Primarchs was an inference rather than a demonstrated fact. But the visions were delivered to a mind that was vulnerable, a mind that was grieving, a mind that was carrying the burden of the Warmaster's responsibility without the Emperor's support, that was isolated from the father whose presence had defined the son's purpose, that was wounded physically by the anatheme's corruption, and emotionally by the accumulated weight of everything the Great Crusade had demanded and the Emperor's departure had denied. The mind accepted the visions. Not completely. The accounts suggest that Horus did not emerge from the Serpent Lodge fully committed to the rebellion that the visions were designed to produce. The corruption was a process, not an event. The Davin vision was the beginning. The full conversion, the complete alignment of Horus's will with the Chaos God's purposes, took time, took the reinforcement that the warrior lodges provided, took the influence of the officers who had already been turned, took the accumulation of grievance and resentment, and the quality of betrayal that the Emperor's absence had produced. But the crack was open. The door was ajar. The corruption that would eventually consume the Warmaster and his legion and the galaxy itself had been introduced, and the introduction could not be undone. Horus emerged from the Serpent Lodge alive, healed, changed. The warriors of the Lunar Wolves noticed the change immediately. The Primarch who returned from Davin's lodge was not the Primarch who had entered it. The difference was subtle. Not a visible corruption, not the physical deformity that Chaos's influence would later produce in less disciplined subjects. A quality of distance. A hardness behind the eyes that had not been there before. The Primarch was still Horus. He was not the same Horus. He renamed the Legion. The Lunar Wolves became the Sons of Horus, a change that Sanguinius had urged before Davin when the renaming was simply an honor. Now the renaming carried a different weight. The Legion was no longer the Emperor's wolves, it was Horus's sons. The shift in allegiance was encoded in the name, and the name was adopted, and the adopting was the Legion's declaration of who it served. Not the Emperor. Horus. The sea green replaced the white. The eye of Horus replaced the wolf's head. The Lunar Wolves were gone. The Sons of Horus had begun. Before Horus could turn the Sons of Horus against the Emperor, he had to turn them against themselves. Not every warrior in the XV Legion was corruptible. The warrior lodges had done their work, spreading the Davinite influence through the Legion's officer corps, building networks of loyalty that ran to Horus personally rather than to the Imperium, identifying the warriors whose commitment to the Primarch could be redirected from the Emperor's service to the Primarch's rebellion. But the lodges could not reach everyone. Some warriors remained loyal to the Imperium. Some were immune to the lodge's influence. Some simply could not be trusted to follow Horus into treachery because their loyalty to the Emperor or to the Imperium's ideals or to their own moral compass exceeded their loyalty to the Primarch. These warriors had to be eliminated, not reassigned, not imprisoned, not given the opportunity to reconsider. Eliminated because a single loyal warrior inside the traitor Legion, a warrior who understood what was happening and who had the capability and the opportunity to communicate the treachery to Terra, could unravel the entire plan before the plan could be executed. Istvan III was the killing ground. The world had been selected for compliance, a legitimate military operation against a rebel civilization that the Warmaster's authority required him to address. The compliance was real. The military operation was real. What was not real, what the loyal warriors who were deployed to the surface did not know, was that the compliance was the cover for their execution. Horus sent the loyalists down. The warriors whose loyalty to the Emperor had been identified by the lodges, the captains, the sergeants, the line warriors whose commitment to the Imperium made them dangerous to the rebellion, were assigned to the assault waves that would make planetfall on Istvan III. They were not told that the assignment was a death sentence. They descended to the surface believing they were prosecuting a standard compliance action. They were not alone. Other traitor legions, the Emperor's children, the Death Guard, the World Eaters, had conducted similar purges, sending their own loyal warriors to Istvan III's surface alongside the Sons of Horus loyalists. The killing ground was multi-legion. The loyalists of 4 different legions were concentrated on a single world, unaware that their deployment was designed to produce their destruction. The virus bombs fell, The orbital bombardment that Horus ordered was not a tactical strike. It was an extermination. Life Eater virus, the biological weapon that consumed organic matter with a thoroughness that left nothing alive, that reduced the biosphere of an entire world to a sterile, decomposing wasteland. The virus bombs were dropped on the positions the Loyalists occupied, and the dropping was the declaration that the heresy had begun. Some Loyalists survived. The warnings came from Captain Saul Tarvitz of the Emperor's Children, who had discovered the plan and raced to the surface to alert the Loyalists before the bombardment fell. Tarvitz's warning gave the Loyalists time. Seconds, minutes, the narrow margin between warning and impact that allowed some warriors to reach shelter before the virus consumed the surface. The firestorm that followed the virus's work, the ignition of the organic gases the decomposition produced, swept across the planet, incinerating everything the virus had killed and sealing the Loyalists in whatever shelter they had found. The survivors emerged into a dead world. The virus and the firestorm had sterilized Istvan and the Third's surface. Every living thing, every organism, every scrap of biological material reduced to ash and gas. The Loyalists stood in the wreckage of a world that had been killed to kill them, and they understood what had happened. They fought. Loken and Torgadon led the Sons of Horus Loyalists, the two Mournival members who had refused the corruption, the phlegmatic and the sanguine, the reason and the conscience, organized the survivors and prepared to resist the assault that they knew would follow. The virus bombardment had not killed them. The traitors would come in person to finish the job. The traitors came. Sons of Horus warriors descended to the surface to engage the survivors, brother fighting brother. Warriors who had served together in the same companies, turning their weapons on each other across the dead ground of Istvan III. The fighting was brutal, personal, saturated with the specific horror of a civil war fought between warriors who knew each other's names and fighting styles and personal histories. The Mournival's end came during the fighting. Horus sent Abaddon and Aximand to confront their former brothers, the choleric and the melancholic, dispatched to kill the sanguine and the phlegmatic. The advisory body that was supposed to prevent catastrophic decisions now deployed as the instrument of the catastrophe's enforcement. Aximand killed Torgadon. Little Horus, the warrior who resembled the Primarch, the melancholic whose thoughtfulness had been submerged by the loyalty that Horus's corruption demanded, fought and killed the Mournival's conscience. The killing was not triumphant. It was terrible. The destruction of a brother by a brother, conducted in the ruins of a dead world, motivated not by hatred, but by the specific compulsion of a loyalty that had been pointed at the wrong target. Abaddon engaged Loken. The first captain, the choleric, the aggressive, the warrior whose loyalty to Horus exceeded every other consideration, fought the warrior who had been the Mournival's rational voice, the outsider who had seen the corruption and tried to prevent it. The fight was interrupted by the collapse of the building they fought in. Abaddon believed Loken dead. Loken was not dead. The rational warrior, buried in the rubble of Istvan III, survived to witness the final orbital bombardment that ended the Loyalists' resistance. Survived to be rescued by the Knights Errant. Survived to carry the testimony of the Lunar Wolves' betrayal into the wider heresy. Istvan III lasted 3 months. 3 months of fighting between brother Astartes on a dead world, the loyalists holding out against the traitors' superior numbers with the desperate tenacity of warriors who had nowhere to retreat to and nothing to lose. The fighting delayed Horus's plans. The 3 months that the Istvan III loyalists bought with their lives were 3 months the Imperium used to begin. Too slowly. Too late. The process of understanding that the Warmaster had turned. The loyalists died, almost all of them. The orbital bombardment that ended the battle consumed the last defenders, and the ground that received them was already saturated with the ashes of the world the virus bombs had killed. Istvan III was the heresy's first battle. It was fought not between the Imperium and its enemies, but between the traitor legions and the loyal warriors within their own ranks. The brothers who were killed not by Xenos or by daemons, but by the brothers they had served beside for decades. The battle's horror is not in the violence. The violence was terrible, but the Astartes were built for violence. The horror is in the intimacy, the killing of people who trusted you. The destruction of the bond that the Legion's culture, the Chthonian bond, the personal loyalty, the brotherhood that was supposed to transcend everything, was built around. The Sons of Horus who survived Istvan III were purified. The loyal elements had been burned away. What remained was a legion that was Horus's completely. Every warrior committed to the rebellion, every officer aligned with the Primarch's purpose, every trace of loyalty to the Emperor eliminated through the specific surgical violence of the purge. The Sons of Horus were ready. Ready for the next killing ground. Istvan V. Gaviel Loken survived. This fact alone makes him the most important warrior in the Sons of Horus's history, who is not Horus and not Abaddon. The 10th captain of the Lunar Wolves, the phlegmatic, the rational voice of the Mournival, the warrior who saw the corruption coming and who tried to stop it, and who failed and who lived to carry the failure's testimony into the Imperium's subsequent history, survived Istvan III. He survived the building's collapse that Abaddon believed had killed him. He survived the virus bombardment and the firestorm, and the 3 months of brother against brother fighting on the dead world's surface. He survived when Torgadon did not, when Sejanus had not, when every other warrior who occupied the space between the corruption and the loyalty found that the space was not survivable. Loken survived because the Imperium needed a witness. Not in the mystical sense. Loken was not preserved by divine intervention or by the Emperor's will expressed through supernatural agency. In the practical sense, the Imperium needed someone who had been inside the corruption's radius and who could describe what the corruption looked like from the inside. The strategic intelligence that Loken carried, the knowledge of how the warrior lodges operated, how the corruption was transmitted through social networks rather than through supernatural mechanisms, how the Mournival was compromised and how the Legion's culture was turned from a strength into a vulnerability, was intelligence the Imperium could not obtain from any other source. Loken was recovered from Istvan III by Nathaniel Garrow, the Death Guard loyalist whose escape from the traitor fleet had brought the first warning of the heresy to Terra. Garrow's mission, conducted under Malkador the Sigillite's authority, was to gather the loyalist survivors from the traitor legions, the warriors whose refusal to follow their Primarchs into treachery had made them the heresy's most valuable intelligence assets. Loken was broken when Garrow found him. Not physically. The Space Marine's body had endured the conditions that would have killed any lesser being. Psychologically, the warrior who had been the Mournival's rational voice, whose clarity of perception had allowed him to see the corruption that the other members had not recognized, was shattered by the experience of watching his legion's destruction from the inside. The brother, killing the virus bombs. The death of Torgadon, the brother whose humor and whose conscience had been the Mournival's counterweight to Abaddon's aggression. The knowledge that the being he had served, the Primarch whose personal magnetism had made the service feel like the most important thing a warrior could do, was the agent of the galaxy's worst catastrophe. Loken was rebuilt. Slowly, painfully, through the process that Malcador's Knights-Errant, the Proto-Inquisition, the organization that would eventually become the institutional apparatus for hunting the kind of corruption Loken had witnessed, provided the rebuilding was not a restoration. Loken did not return to the warrior he had been before Istvan III. He became something different, harder, darker, carrying the scar tissue of an experience that had destroyed the version of reality he had lived in and replaced it with one he had not been prepared for. The Knights-Errant sent Loken back into the war. The missions the Sigillite assigned were not conventional military operations, they were intelligence operations, infiltrations, the kind of covert work that the Proto-Inquisition required in conditions where the conventional military could not operate. Loken fought the Long War's opening chapters from the inside, using the knowledge of the Sons of Horus's culture that his membership in the Mournival had provided to penetrate the traitor force's operations, and to gather the intelligence that the Loyalist command needed. The confrontation on Molech was the most painful mission. Loken was part of the Knights-Errant team that infiltrated the Vengeful Spirit during the Sons of Horus's assault on the Night World, and the infiltration brought Loken face to face with the pre-heresy Mournival's ghost. The 4 members of the original advisory body, Abaddon, Torgadon, Thrushaco, Aximand, and Loken himself, were briefly reunited aboard the vessel that had been their home during the Great Crusade, in conditions that were as far from the Crusade's glory as the warp was from the Materium. The reunion confirmed what Loken already knew. The Mournival was dead. Not simply in the physical sense, Torgadon was dead, and the other 3 had been transformed by the heresy into beings the pre-heresy Mournival would not have recognized. The institution was dead. The advisory body that had balanced the Primarch's judgment was gone, replaced by the corrupted parody that the heresy's demands had produced. Abaddon, Aximand, Kibre, and a daemon-possessed replacement whose presence in the Mournival's ranks was the measure of everything the institution had lost. Loken endured. Through the heresy's remaining years, through the siege of Terra, through the aftermath that produced the Imperium that survives in the 41st millennium, the last loyal Lunar Wolf, the warrior who had worn the white armor and who had served in the Mournival, and who had watched the greatest legion in the Imperium destroy itself from the inside, endured because endurance was the thing the experience had left him with. And the endurance was all that was required. His testimony survives in the records of the organization that Malcador built, the institution that became the Inquisition. The testimony is classified, restricted to the highest levels of the Ordo Hereticus, available only to the Inquisitors, whose work requires them to understand how a Space Marine Legion can be corrupted from within. The testimony describes the lodges. The testimony describes the Mournival's failure. The testimony describes the personal quality of Horus's leadership, and how the quality that made the leadership effective was the quality that made the corruption devastating. The testimony says, "This is how it happened. This is what it looked like from the inside. This is the mechanism. Learn it." Because the mechanism can be replicated, and the replication can happen to any force whose culture produces the conditions the mechanism exploits. Garviel Loken, 10th Captain of the Lunar Wolves, phlegmatic of the Mournival, the last loyal son of a legion that betrayed everything. His survival is the heresy's most important outcome, because his survival preserved the knowledge that the Imperium needs to prevent the heresy from happening again. Whether the Imperium has used the knowledge effectively is a question that 10,000 years have not conclusively answered. The drop site massacre was the Sons of Horus's masterpiece of treachery, and the treachery was Horus's finest tactical achievement. The plan was elegant in its cruelty. 7 legions dispatched by the Emperor to destroy the traitor forces at Istvan Fee, the first 3 in the assault wave, the remaining 4 in the reinforcement wave. The 3 loyal legions, Iron Hands, Salamanders, Raven Guard, struck the traitor positions with the combined force that 3 legions of the Adeptus Astartes could bring. The fight was fierce. The traitors' defenses held but buckled under the pressure. The loyal Primarchs, Ferrus, Manus, Vulcan, Corax, pressed the assault, confident that the reinforcement wave would arrive and complete the destruction. The reinforcement wave arrived. The Iron Warriors, the Night Lords, the Word Bearers, the Alpha Legion descended to the battlefield and took up their positions, and opened fire on the Loyalists. 4 legions that the Emperor had believed were loyal revealed themselves as traitors. The reinforcement that was supposed to be the anvil against which the first wave's hammer would shatter the rebellion turned its weapons on the hammer instead, and the first wave, caught between the traitor defenses and the traitor reinforcements, fighting on 2 fronts against 7 legions instead of 3, was annihilated. Ferrus Manus charged Fulgrim. The Iron Hands Primarch, driven by fury at the betrayal, drove into the traitor lines seeking his brother, his closest friend among the Primarchs, the being whose corruption he could not accept. Fulgrim killed him. Beheaded the Iron Hands Primarch with a demonic blade, the first Primarch to die in the heresy, his head taken as a trophy by the brother who had loved him. The Salamanders and the Raven Guard were shattered. Vulcan was lost, overwhelmed, his fate unknown for centuries. Corax survived, barely, leading fewer than 3,000 survivors through 98 days of guerrilla warfare on Istvan V's surface before extraction. The Dropsite massacre was not a battle. It was an ambush scaled to the level of legions. And the ambush's architect was Horus. The Warmaster had designed the trap, had positioned the loyal and treacherous elements of the reinforcement wave, with the precision that his decades of tactical experience provided, had calculated the timing that would produce maximum devastation, had ensured that the loyal legions would be fully committed before the trap was sprung. This was the throat strike applied to the Imperium itself. The same doctrine that had made the Lunar Wolves the Crusade's most effective force, identify the center of gravity and eliminate it, was now directed at the Imperium's military capability. The center of gravity was the legions, destroy the loyal legions, and the Imperium's ability to resist the rebellion collapses. The Dropsite massacre destroyed 3 legions in a single afternoon, and the destruction was Horus's finest tactical achievement, and the achievement was the worst thing a military commander has ever done. After Istvan Fee, the war expanded. The heresy, which had begun as a purge within the traitor legions and escalated to a massacre between legions, became a galactic civil war. The traitor forces advanced toward Terra. The loyal forces attempted to stop them. The galaxy tore itself apart. The Sons of Horus were at the heart of it. The Warmaster's legion fought in every major campaign the rebellion produced, not always as the primary combatants, but always as the force whose Primarchs' authority directed the rebellion's overall strategy. Horus was the Warmaster. The title, once the Imperium's supreme military honor, was now the rebellion's supreme command. The march on Terra was not direct. The rebellion's advance through the galaxy was contested, delayed, redirected by the loyalist forces that opposed it, and by the internal dynamics of the traitor coalition, the competing ambitions, the divergent purposes, the fundamental difficulty of coordinating 8 legions and their associated mortal forces across a galactic front. The Sons of Horus maintained cohesion better than most traitor legions, because the Chthonian loyalty structure that defined the legion held even as the war's pressures fragmented other forces. On Molech, the Sons of Horus fought one of the heresy's most significant engagements. The night world of Molech, defended by loyalist forces, fortified by the presence of an ancient gateway that the Emperor himself had sealed millennia before, was assaulted by the Sons of Horus in force, and the assault's purpose went beyond the military. Horus needed what was behind the gate. The gateway led to the realm of chaos, to the source of the power that the Emperor had accessed during his own ascension, the warp-derived capability that had made the Master of Mankind what he was. Horus passed through the gateway. What he gained on the other side, the power, the knowledge, the chaos-infused enhancement that the passage provided, elevated the Warmaster to something approaching the Emperor's own capability. The cost of the passage was Horus's remaining humanity. Whatever fragment of the Warmaster's original self had survived Davin's corruption was consumed by the passage through the gate, and the being who emerged was no longer Horus in any meaningful sense. He was the vessel of the Chaos Gods' combined will, carrying their power toward Terra with the purpose that the Chaos Gods had been working toward since before the Great Crusade began. The Solar War was the heresy's penultimate campaign. The traitor fleets, led by the Sons of Horus, supported by the other traitor legions and their mortal allies, entered the Sol system and engaged the loyalist defenses that Rogel Dawn had built around Terra. The Solar War was fought across the system's planets and stations and void spaces, and the fighting was ferocious, and the Sons of Horus were at the center of every major engagement. Horus broke through. The solar defenses, formidable as they were, could not hold against the combined weight of the traitor forces and the Warmaster's chaos-enhanced tactical capability. Terra was reached. The siege began. The Justaerin Terminators were the Sons of Horus's killing edge. And the killing edge tells you everything about the legion that wielded it. Abaddon's personal command. The First Company. The elite of the elite. The warriors whose capability exceeded the already formidable standard that the lunar worlds maintained. The Justaerin wore black Terminator armor while the rest of the Legion wore sea green, and the black distinguished them as the formation whose purpose was the throat strike, the identification and destruction of the enemy's command structure, the decapitation operation that the Lunar Wolves' doctrine prescribed as the method for winning wars quickly. The Justaerin were not simply better warriors than the line companies. They were a different kind of warrior, selected for the combination of combat capability and tactical intelligence that the throat strike required, trained in the methods of the precision assault that targeted the single critical point whose destruction would collapse the enemy's resistance. A Justaerin warrior could operate in a kill team, infiltrating behind enemy lines, reaching the command bunker or the political headquarters or the communications center that held the opposition together. A Justaerin squad could fight its way through a fortified position with the concentrated violence that Terminator armor permitted, absorbing fire that would destroy conventional forces and delivering the firepower that the armor's weapon systems provided. Abaddon modeled the Justaerin on himself. The first captain's personal combat style, direct, overwhelming, conducted at close range with the Talon of Horus that would later become his most feared weapon, was replicated across the First Company's entire tactical profile. The Justaerin fought the way Abaddon fought, in the enemy's face, at the range where the killing was personal, with the force that left the opponent no room to recover. The Catalan Reavers were the other face of the Legion's elite, a formation of assault specialists whose approach to combat was closer to the Chthonian gang warfare that had produced the Legion's culture than to the disciplined formations that the Justaerin represented. The Reavers were savage. Not undisciplined, the distinction matters, because the Reavers' savagery was controlled, directed, channeled toward specific tactical outcomes, but savage in the intensity of the engagement, in the willingness to close with the enemy and fight at a range where the fighting was as much about intimidation as it was about killing. The Reavers carried the marks of their kills, the practice, decorating armor with the trophies of fallen enemies, displaying the evidence of victories in the kind of visible, aggressive self-promotion that Chthonia's gang culture had encouraged, was common throughout the Legion but was most pronounced in the Reavers, whose members regarded the display of trophies as a professional obligation rather than a personal indulgence. Both formations, the Justaerin and the Reavers, embodied the Legion's essential character in different ways. The Justaerin were the character's disciplined expression, the throat strike conducted with precision, the violence channeled through training and equipment into the surgical application of force at the critical point. The Reavers were the character's raw expression, the gang war scaled up to galactic proportions, the Chthonian ferocity maintained alongside the Great Crusade's professionalism, the violence that was not surgical but visceral, the kind of violence that Chthonia's tunnels produced, and that the Legion had never entirely civilized away. During the heresy, both formations fought with the commitment that the Sons of Horus's character demanded. The Justaerin led the assaults on the Imperial Palace during the Siege of Terror, Abaddon at their head, fighting through the fortifications that Dawn had built with the concentrated fury that the throat strike doctrine prescribed. The Reavers fought alongside them, providing the close quarters violence that the siege's urban combat demanded, turning the palace's corridors and chambers into the kind of tunnel warfare that Chthonian had trained them for. The formation's effectiveness during the heresy is evidence that the Sons of Horus's military capability was not diminished by the corruption. If anything, the corruption enhanced it, the Chaos God's influence providing physical capabilities that exceeded what the gene seed alone could produce. The fury that the corruption generated directing the warrior's violence with an intensity that the pre-heresy Sons of Horus had not maintained. The enhancement was temporary, The corruption that enhanced the warriors' combat capability was the same corruption that would eventually consume their discipline, their identity, their capacity to function as a coherent military force. The Sons of Horus who fought at the Siege of Terror were the most powerful version of the Exvi Legion that had ever existed. They were also the version that was closest to the collapse that the corruption's full expression would produce. The Justarin survive in the Black Legion. Abaddon's personal formation, now the Black Legion's elite rather than the Sons of Horus's, maintains the tactical traditions that the first captain established during the Great Crusade and refined during the heresy. The black armor that distinguished the Justarin from the sea green of the broader legion is now the armor of the entire force. And the distinction that the black once provided is gone, because the force that absorbed the Justarin has adopted the Justarin's color as its own. The Reavers are gone. The formation's raw Chthonian character, the gang-lord ferocity that the Legion had maintained alongside its military professionalism, did not survive the transition to the Black Legion. The Reaver's spirit persists in some Black Legion warbands, whose combat style reflects the close-quarters savagery that the Reavers embodied, but the formation itself, the named unit with the named traditions and the named identity, is a casualty of the dissolution that Abaddon imposed on the Sons of Horus's institutional structure. The Justarin and the Reavers were the Legion in concentrated form. The Justarin were the discipline. The Reavers were the fury. Together they were the Sons of Horus, the force that was the best because it combined the qualities that other forces kept separate, and that was the worst because the combination, once corrupted, produced a capability for destruction that exceeded anything the individual qualities could have generated alone. The Siege of Terror was the culmination of the heresy, and the moment when the Sons of Horus fought for the prize their Primarch had been promised. The Imperial Palace, the continent-spanning fortification that Rogel Dawn had built on Terra's surface, the seat of the Emperor's governance, the physical embodiment of everything the Imperium represented, was surrounded. The traitor legions pressed the assault from every direction, supported by Dark Mechanicum engines and Daemon allies and the mortal forces that the rebellion had accumulated across its march through the galaxy. The Loyalist defenders, the Imperial Fists, the White Scars, the Blood Angels, the Custodians, and the mortal armies that Terra's population had provided, held the walls against an assault whose scale exceeded anything the galaxy had witnessed since the War in Heaven. The Sons of Horus fought at the tip, as they had always fought, at the point of maximum engagement, at the forefront of the assault, carrying their Primarch's banner into the most contested ground the battle produced. The Justarin Terminators, Abaddon at their head, assaulted the palace's fortifications with the ferocity that the first captain brought to every engagement. The Sons of Horus line companies fought alongside the World Eaters and the Emperor's children and the Death Guard, pressing the walls, scaling the breaches, dying and killing in the specific arithmetic of siege warfare that measured progress in meters and paid for each meter in blood. Abaddon led the assault on the Saturnine Gate, one of the palace's major entry points, defended by the Imperial Fists with the stubborn tenacity that Dawn's warriors brought to defensive warfare. The assault was a calculated gamble, a feint within a feint that the Mournival, now comprising Abaddon, Aximand, Falcus Kibre, and the Daemon, possessed Tormageddon, had designed to draw the Loyalists' reserves away from the sectors the main assault would target. The Saturnine assault failed. The gamble did not pay off. The imperial fists held, and the Sons of Horus who had made the assault paid the price of its failure. Throughout the siege, Horus was deteriorating. The Chaos God's power was consuming the Warmaster. The enhancement that Molech's gateway had provided, the godlike capability that had elevated Horus to something approaching the Emperor's own level, was not a gift freely given. It was a loan, and the loan's interest was being collected in the currency of Horus's sanity. The Warmaster, who had designed the heresy's military strategy with the tactical brilliance that had defined his career, was losing the capacity to direct the strategy's execution. He withdrew from the day-to-day management of the siege. He retreated to the Vengeful Spirit, his flagship, the Sons of Horus's mobile headquarters, and sealed himself in his chambers. And the sealing was not the retreat of a commander preserving his energy for the critical moment. It was the withdrawal of a being whose mind was being devoured by the entities whose power he carried. The siege ground on. Without Horus's direct leadership, the traitor forces lost cohesion. The other Primarchs, Perturabo, Mortarion, Angron, Fulgrim, prosecuted their own campaigns within the siege according to their own priorities, and the priorities were not always aligned. Perturabo wanted to breach the walls through methodical siege warfare. Angron wanted to charge. Fulgrim was increasingly distracted by the sensory excess that Slanesh's influence produced. The unified command that the Warmaster's authority should have provided was absent because the Warmaster was absent. Abaddon held the Sons of Horus together. The first captain, who had followed Horus into treachery without hesitation and who had committed every atrocity the rebellion demanded with the directness that his choleric temperament prescribed, now found himself carrying the burden that the Warmaster had dropped. Abaddon directed the Sons of Horus's operations during the siege's middle phases, maintained the Legion's combat effectiveness, and tried with increasing desperation to reach the Primarch, whose withdrawal was undermining the campaign the Primarch had started. The Warmaster's emissary, Argonis, reported the deterioration with the specific horror of a being who had served Horus in the Warmaster's prime and who was now watching the prime's collapse. Horus was raving. Horus was incoherent. Horus was at moments something that was no longer recognizably the being who had planned the most effective military campaign in human history. The Chaos God's power was running through the Warmaster's mind like an electrical current through a conductor that was not designed for the voltage, and the conductor was burning out. The Emperor knew. Through whatever psychic means the master of mankind employed to monitor the battlefield, the clairvoyance, the precognition, the quality of awareness that the Emperor's psychic power provided, he knew that Horus was failing. The Warmaster's mind was disintegrating. The rebellion's command structure was collapsing. Time was on the Emperor's side, because the Chaos God's investment in Horus was consuming its vessel, and a vessel that was consumed could not sustain the campaign. And then the Emperor received the information that changed the assessment. Loyalist reinforcements were approaching. The Ultramarines, the Dark Angels, the Space Wolves, the legions that the traitor forces had delayed and misdirected throughout the heresy were finally converging on Terra, and their arrival would shift the siege's balance decisively in the Emperor's favor. But the arrival would take time, days perhaps, and the days would only matter if the palace held. Horus knew this too. and the knowledge, whether it penetrated the chaos-corroded remains of his tactical mind through his own analysis, or was delivered to him by the chaos gods who could perceive the approaching reinforcements through the warp, produced the final gamble. The Warmaster lowered the vengeful spirit's void shield. The lowering was an invitation, a challenge, a statement that said, "Come and face me." The Emperor could teleport aboard the vengeful spirit, the psychic teleportation that the Emperor's power made possible, and face Horus directly. The duel that the heresy had been building toward since Davin. Father against son, creator against creation. The being who had made the Primarchs against the Primarch who had betrayed him. The Emperor accepted. He boarded the vengeful spirit with a force that included Sanguinius, the angel, the Primarch of the Blood Angels, the son whose loyalty had never wavered, whose love for the Emperor and for his brothers had survived the heresy's corruptions, whose presence at the Emperor's side during the boarding was both military necessity and personal choice. Rogaldorn followed, with elements of the Imperial fists. The custodians accompanied their master. Sanguinius reached Horus first. The angel found the Warmaster on the bridge of the vengeful spirit, and the two Primarchs who had once been the closest of brothers faced each other across the gap that the heresy had opened between them. Horus killed Sanguinius. The details of the killing are the Imperium's most sacred and most painful memory. Sanguinius, the angel, the most beloved of the Primarchs, the being whose beauty and whose nobility represented everything the Imperium aspired to, died aboard the vengeful spirit, killed by the brother who had once loved him. The killing was not a duel between equals. Sanguinius was exhausted from the siege's fighting. Horus was empowered by the chaos gods. The outcome was assured before the first blow fell. Sanguinius died. The angel's body lay broken on the deck of the vengeful spirit, and the Warmaster who had killed him stood over the corpse of the brother he had once been closest to, and the standing was the measure of everything the heresy had consumed. The Emperor arrived. The duel between the Emperor and Horus Lupercal is the defining event of the Imperium's history, and the event's details are contested, revised, theologized, and mythologized, to the point where the historical record and the mythology have become inseparable. What is consistent across the accounts is the outcome. The Emperor was wounded. Terribly wounded. The chaos-enhanced Warmaster struck the master of mankind with power that exceeded anything a Primarch should have been capable of, and the wounds the Emperor sustained were mortal, not immediately lethal but irreversible, damage that the Emperor's superhuman physiology could not heal, wounds that would require the Golden Throne's life-sustaining machinery to prevent from killing the being who sat upon it. And the Emperor struck back. The moment is described differently in different accounts. In some, the Emperor held back throughout the duel, unable or unwilling to kill his son, hoping until the last moment that Horus could be redeemed, that the corruption could be reversed, that the Warmaster could be saved. In some, the Emperor saw in Horus's eyes, in the final moment, a flicker of the sun he had made, a brief return of the being that Horus had been before Davin, before the corruption, before the chaos gods consumed everything that made the Warmaster worth saving. And then Horus killed a perpetual, Olanius Pius, or a custodian, or a space marine. The accounts vary. Entered the chamber and was destroyed by Horus with the casual contempt of a god vessel swatting an insect. And the casual contempt, the utter disregard for life that the killing demonstrated, showed the Emperor the truth that he had been resisting. The sun was gone. There was nothing of Horus left to save. The corruption was total. The vessel was empty of everything except the Chaos God's will. The Emperor struck. With the full force of his psychic might, the power that had unified Terra, that had created the Primarchs, that had sustained the Astronomicon, the accumulated psychic capability of the most powerful human psyker who had ever existed. The blow was not physical, it was spiritual. The Emperor reached through the warp and erased Horus, not simply killing his body but destroying his soul, obliterating the Warmaster's psychic presence with a finality that ensured Horus could not be resurrected, could not be recovered, could not be returned by the Chaos Gods who had invested so heavily in his corruption. Horus Lupercal died aboard the Vengeful Spirit. The Warmaster, the first found, the favored son, the being who had been the Imperium's greatest champion and who became its greatest enemy, died under his father's hand, destroyed by a blow that cost the Emperor everything he had left to give. The Emperor collapsed. The wounds Horus had inflicted were killing him. The custodians carried the master of mankind back to Terra, back to the Imperial Palace, back to the golden throne that had been built for the Webway project and that would now serve as the Emperor's life support for the next 10,000 years. The siege broke. The traitor forces, deprived of their Warmaster, lost the cohesion that Horus's authority had provided. The approaching loyalist reinforcements completed the rout. The traitor legions fled into the warp toward the Eye of Terror, away from the defeat that Horus's death had made inevitable. The heresy was over. The Imperium had survived. The cost was everything. Abaddon took the body. When Horus fell, when the Emperor's psychic blow destroyed the Warmaster and the Vengeful Spirit's bridge became a mausoleum, it was Abaddon who acted, the first captain who had followed his Primarch through every battle of the heresy, who had committed atrocities without hesitation because the atrocities served Horus's purpose, who had held the Sons of Horus together during the siege while the Warmaster withdrew into his chaos-corroded chambers. Abaddon fought his way to Horus's body and carried it out. The carrying was not simple. The siege was collapsing around the traitors. The loyalist forces, energized by the psychic shockwave of Horus's death, a pulse that every psyker on Terra felt, that reverberated through the warp with the force of a dying god's final exhalation, were counterattacking. The traitor legions were breaking. The Sons of Horus warriors who had been fighting at the palace walls moments before were now fighting to reach their transports, to reach the Vengeful Spirit, to reach the ships that could carry them away from the defeat that was consuming everything. Abaddon fought through the collapse. He carried Horus's body, the body of a Primarch, massive even in death. The superhuman physique that the Emperor's genecraft had produced now a dead weight that the first captain shouldered through the killing ground with the determination of a warrior who had decided that this was the thing that mattered, and that nothing else was relevant. The Sons of Horus fled Terra. The Vengeful Spirit broke orbit, carrying the surviving warriors and the body of their dead Primarch away from the world they had come to conquer, into the void toward the Eye of Terror, the warp rift that would provide the refuge the defeated legions needed. The flight was not orderly. The Sons of Horus who escaped Terra did so in fragments, individual ships, small flotillas, scattered elements of a legion that had lost its central authority with the death of the being who was the central authority. Horus had been the legion. His death was the legion's death. and the warriors who survived the death were survivors in the most literal sense, beings who had outlived the thing that gave their existence purpose. The Eye of Terror swallowed them. The great warp rift that Slaanesh's birth had torn in reality, the region of space where the material universe and the immaterium bled together, where the laws of physics were suggestions and the Chaos God's influence was absolute, became the Sons of Horus's refuge and their prison. Inside the Eye, the defeated warriors of the XV Legion were safe from Imperial pursuit. Inside the Eye, they were also trapped, unable to return to the galaxy they had tried to conquer, surrounded by the warp's corrupting influence, competing with the other traitor legions for the resources and the territory that the Eye's marginal worlds provided. The competition was brutal. The traitor legions that had fought alongside each other during the heresy turned on each other inside the Eye with a ferocity that exceeded the heresy's fratricidal violence. The Legion Wars, the period of intra-traitor conflict that followed the retreat into the Eye, were the aftermath of the heresy expressed in the most direct possible terms. Warriors whose common cause had been destroyed fighting over the wreckage, each legion competing for the supremacy that the heresy's failure had denied. The Sons of Horus suffered more than most in the Legion Wars. The Legion's identity was their Primarch, and the Primarch was dead, and the death had removed the foundation that everything else was built on. Without Horus, the Sons of Horus were not the sons of anything. They were a force whose name was a reminder of their loss, whose identity was defined by the absence of the being who had defined their identity and whose purpose. The rebellion, the conquest, the vision that Horus had articulated, was now the memory of a failure so complete that the memory itself was corrosive. The other traitor legions attacked them, the World Eaters, the Emperor's children, the other fragments of the rebellion's coalition. They fell on the Sons of Horus with the predatory aggression of factions that recognized vulnerability, and that the Eye's Darwinian conditions encouraged to exploit it. The Sons of Horus were targeted specifically because the legion that had led the heresy was also the legion whose defeat was most satisfying to the legions that had followed it. And Abaddon was gone, the first captain, who had been the Sons of Horus's most capable leader, who had carried the Primarch's body through the siege's collapse, who should have been the being who held the legion together in the aftermath of Horus's death. Abaddon vanished. He abandoned the Sons of Horus. He walked into the Eye of Terror alone, leaving the legion he had served behind, consumed by a despair that his choleric temperament could not process, and that the death of his Primarch had produced. Without Abaddon, without Horus, without the Mournival destroyed at Istvan Thray and never adequately replaced, the Sons of Horus collapsed. The legion that had been the Imperium's finest fighting force, the force that had won more campaigns than any other, that had been elevated above all its peers, that had been trusted with the Warmaster's authority, disintegrated into warbands and fragments and the specific wreckage of an institution that had been built around a single point of failure and that had inevitably failed when the point was removed. They retreated to Malium, a daemon world of rusted metal and decaying starship hulks, a graveyard world where the dead things the warp had consumed lay in twisted piles of corroded steel. On Malium, the Sons of Horus built a fortress, Lupercalios, fashioned from the wrecks of vessels lost to the warp, each tower a jagged prow of an ancient void ship, the entire structure a monument to the salvage that the Eye's conditions permitted. They interred Horus's body. The Primarch's corpse, preserved in stasis, was placed in a tomb within Lupercalios, and around the tomb the Sons of Horus gathered. Not as a fighting force, not as a legion with a purpose, as mourners, worshippers, some of them, warriors who had followed their Primarch into damnation, and who now sat in the wreckage of the damnation and prayed to the body of the being who had led them there. The worship was pathetic. Not in the sympathetic sense, but in the literal sense. A response born from suffering that the sufferers could not understand or escape. The Sons of Horus had been the galaxy's mightiest warriors. They were now the galaxy's most visible failures, hiding in the eye of terror, guarding the body of a dead demigod, fighting off the other traitor legions who attacked their fortress with the regularity that the eye's competitive dynamics produced. The fall was complete. From the pinnacle of the Great Crusade to the nadir of the Eye of Terror, from the Warmaster's own to the refuse of the Long War, from the best to the worst. The Sons of Horus, whose Primarch's name had given the galaxy's greatest civil war its name, had become a footnote in the history they had authored. And in the darkness of his exile, somewhere in the eye's unmapped depths, Abaddon watched and thought and planned, because the first captain was not done. While Abaddon wandered in the eye's darkness, Fabius Bile came to Malium, the Clone Lord, the former chief apothecary of the Emperor's children, the geneticist whose obsession with the perfection of biological material had driven him to experiments that exceeded every boundary the Imperium's ethics had established, came to the Sons of Horus's fortress with a proposition. Bile possessed the capability to clone a Primarch. He had studied the Primarch's biology with the thoroughness that his obsession demanded, and the study had produced the knowledge required to replicate the gene craft that the Emperor had used to create them. Bile offered to clone Horus, the Sons of Horus, leaderless, purposeless, clinging to the body of their dead Primarch as the only remaining anchor of their identity, accepted the offer with the desperate eagerness of beings who had been drowning and who had been thrown a line. The cloning began. The Primarch's biological material, preserved in the stasis field that maintained the body, was sampled, cultivated, accelerated through processes that Bile's genius and Bile's ethical vacuity made possible. The clone grew. From the biological material of the dead Warmaster, Bile produced a being that resembled Horus, the physical form, the superhuman physiology, the face that the Sons of Horus remembered and that the galaxy feared. The clone looked like Horus. It moved like Horus. It occupied the space that Horus had occupied with the physical presence that the Primarch's gene craft produced. It was not Horus. The clone did not contain the Warmaster's soul. The being that emerged from Bile's processes was a biological replica, a body without the spirit, a vessel without the contents, a copy of the surface without the depths that the surface had concealed. The clone did not have Horus's strategic genius. It did not have his charisma. It did not have the capacity for leadership that had made the Warmaster the being the galaxy had followed into rebellion. It was, in the most precise possible terms, an empty shell. But the Sons of Horus did not care. The shell was enough. The appearance of their Primarch, the face, the body, the physical presence of the being they had followed into damnation was sufficient to produce the obedience that the living Horus had commanded. The Sons of Horus knelt to the clone. They worshipped it. They offered it the devotion they had given the Primarch, directed now at a biological machine that wore the Primarch's face. The worship was a degradation so complete that it exceeded the original fall. The Sons of Horus had followed Horus into treachery because they believed in him, in his vision, his capability, his right to lead the galaxy in the direction he chose. Following the clone was not belief. It was desperation. The Sons of Horus were so broken, so emptied of purpose, so consumed by the loss of the being who had been their purpose, that they accepted a copy of the thing they had lost because the copy was the closest thing to the thing that was available. And then Abaddon returned. The first captain emerged from his exile with the clarity of a being who had processed his despair and arrived at a conclusion the despair had not permitted while the processing was underway. The conclusion was this: the Sons of Horus were finished. Not as individual warriors. The warriors were still capable, still dangerous, still formidable in the violent way that Space Marines are formidable regardless of their institutional condition. As a legion, as an identity. As the Sons of Horus, the beings defined by their relationship to a dead Primarch whose name was the name of the Imperium's greatest catastrophe. The name was the problem. Sons of Horus was not an identity. It was a leash. It tied the Legion to a being who was dead and to a failure that was permanent. It defined the warriors not by what they were, but by what they had lost. And the definition produced the behavior, the mourning, the worship, the pathetic clinging to the body, and now the clone of the Primarch whose death had rendered the Legion purposeless. Abaddon looked at the clone and understood what it represented. Not a resurrection, a trap. The clone was the mechanism by which the Sons of Horus would remain the Sons of Horus forever, tethered to the dead Warmaster's image, defined by the dead Warmaster's failure, incapable of becoming anything other than the mourners of a being who was never coming back. Abaddon destroyed the clone. He killed the being that Fabius Bile had created from the biological material of his Primarch. He killed the thing that wore Horus's face and that the Sons of Horus worshipped as a substitute for the Primarch they had lost. He killed the last physical remnant of Horus Lupercal, the body that the stasis field had preserved, the clone that Bile had grown, and in the killing, he severed the Legion's connection to the being that had been its identity. The Sons of Horus were dead. Abaddon declared them dead. He proclaimed the end of the Xvi Legion, not as a continuation of the Sons of Horus under a new name, but as the termination of the Sons of Horus and the creation of something entirely new. The Black Legion. The name was chosen with the precision that Abaddon brought to everything he did. Black, the color of mourning, the color of the armor that the Sons of Horus had painted in grief after the Warmaster's death, but also the color of negation, the color of the void, the color of the absence that the Sons of Horus had been wallowing in, transformed from a symbol of loss into a symbol of purpose. The Black Legion would wear the mourning as armor rather than as a shroud. The grief would fuel the war rather than paralyzing it. The Legion was not simply renamed, it was reconstituted. Abaddon did not claim the Sons of Horus's identity and repaint it. He dissolved the Sons of Horus, terminated the Xvi Legion's existence as an institution, ended the lineage that connected the Black Legion to the Lunar Wolves and to Horus, and built something new from the wreckage. The Black Legion was not the Sons of Horus under a new name. It was a new force, drawing from the Sons of Horus's survivors, but incorporating warriors from other legions as well. Any Chaos Space Marine who was willing to set aside his original Legion identity and commit to the Black Legion's purpose. The purpose was the Long War, not Horus's war. Horus's war was over. Horus's war had ended with the Warmaster's death and the rebellion's failure, and the Sons of Horus's collapse into the Eye of Terror. The Long War was Abaddon's, a new war, fought for Abaddon's objectives, directed by Abaddon's strategy, sustained by Abaddon's will. The objectives were not Horus's objectives. Horus had fought to replace the Emperor, to seize the Imperium and rule it with himself at its head. Abaddon's war was not about replacement. It was about destruction. The Imperium would burn. Not because Abaddon wanted to sit on the golden throne, because the Imperium was the thing the Emperor had built, and the Emperor had failed his sons, and the failure would be answered by the destruction of everything the failure had produced. Let the galaxy burn. The words are attributed to Horus, but the sentiment is Abaddon's. The Warmaster had wanted to rule. The Despoiler wanted to destroy. The difference between the two is the difference between ambition and hatred, and the difference shaped everything the Black Legion would become. The Black Crusades are Abaddon's masterwork, and the masterwork has taken 10,000 years to complete. 13 Crusades. 13 times the Black Legion has poured out of the Eye of Terror at the head of a coalition of chaos forces, traitor legions, daemon armies, dark mechanicum engines, cultist hordes, the accumulated military refuse of 10 millennia of the Long War, and struck the Imperium with concentrated fury. 13 times the Imperium has marshaled its defenses and fought the crusade to a standstill, or a defeat, or the kind of bloody stalemate that both sides claim as victory. The Imperium's histories present the first 12 Black Crusades as failures. Abaddon attacked. Abaddon was repelled. Abaddon retreated to the Eye of Terror to lick his wounds and plan the next attempt. The Despoiler is the Imperium's favorite example of the enemy who cannot win. The Chaos Warlord who throws his forces against the Imperium's defenses and who is thrown back every time. Proof that the Emperor's servants can withstand whatever the forces of chaos produce. This narrative is wrong. The Black Crusades were not failed invasion attempts. They were operations, individually designed, each with objectives that were not always territorial, whose success or failure must be measured not by whether Abaddon held ground, but by whether Abaddon achieved what he set out to achieve. The first 12 Crusades were not 13 failed attempts to do the same thing. They were 13 different operations, each targeting a different objective, each advancing a plan whose full scope the Imperium did not understand until the 13th Crusade revealed it. The First Black Crusade destroyed the last Loyalist Space Marine presence in the Eye of Terror's immediate vicinity. The Fourth recovered the Daemon Sword Drachnian, a weapon of tremendous warp-born power that became Abaddon's personal armament. The Seventh destroyed specific Imperial defensive infrastructure in the Cadian Gate region. Each crusade accomplished something, each built toward the culmination that the 13th represented. Abaddon's genius, the quality that separates him from every other Chaos Warlord who has attacked the Imperium from the Eye of Terror, is patience, not the patience of a being who waits because he has no alternative. The active patience of a strategist who understands that the objective he is pursuing requires preparations that span millennia. and who is willing to invest the millennia because the objective is worth the investment. The Chthonian gang lord's patience scaled to 10,000 years. The 13th Black Crusade was the culmination, the crusade that the previous 12 had been building toward. The assault whose preparation had consumed 10 millennia of planning and 12 preliminary campaigns, and the accumulated resources of a civilization in exile that had been fighting the long war since the heresy's end. Cadia was the target. The fortress world, the Imperium's primary defense against the Eye of Terror, the world whose pylons held the warp's expansion in check, whose garrison was among the most heavily fortified in the galaxy, whose position at the Eye's mouth made it the gate through which any force from the Eye must pass to reach the Imperium beyond. Abaddon did not want to conquer Cadia. He wanted to destroy it. The assault was the largest military operation the galaxy had seen since the heresy itself. The Black Legion, supported by every available Chaos force, traitor legions, daemon allies, the Crimson Slaughter, the Warbands and the cults and the monstrous engines that 10,000 years of the Eye's corruption had produced, descended on Cadia with an intensity that exceeded anything the fortress world's defenses had been built to withstand. The fighting was apocalyptic. Cadia's defenders, Imperial Guard regiments, Space Marine forces, the Cadian shock troops whose entire culture was built around the defense of the Eye's gate, fought with the desperation of warriors who understood that the world they were defending was the Imperium's last barrier against the Eye of Terror's expansion. The fighting lasted for weeks. The casualties were staggering. The ground was contested meter by meter, building by building, in conditions that exceeded the Siege of Terror's violence in concentration if not in scale. Cadia fell. Not through military defeat alone. The defenders held longer than Abaddon's operational timeline had anticipated, and the holding cost the Black Legion forces that the despoiler could not easily replace. Cadia fell because Abaddon directed the Blackstone Fortress, a massive ancient void station of alien origin, capable of projecting destructive force at a planetary scale, into the world itself. The Blackstone Fortress was crashed into Cadia's surface, and the impact's force, combined with the destruction of the pylons that the impact produced, shattered the world. The planet broke. Cadia broke. Physically, geologically, catastrophically, the world that had held the Eye of Terror's expansion in check for 10,000 years was destroyed. And the destruction was not simply the loss of a world. It was the loss of the mechanism that had maintained the barrier between the Eye and the Imperium. The Cadian pylon's destruction produced the Great Rift. The Cicatrix Maledictum, the galaxy-spanning warp storm that erupted from the Eye of Terror's uncontained expansion, tore reality in half, dividing the Imperium into the lit and the dark halves, disrupting communications, severing supply lines, producing the most significant strategic crisis the Imperium had faced since the heresy itself. Cadia stands. The phrase became the Imperium's memorial for the world and its defenders, a declaration that the fortress world's spirit survived even though its physical existence did not. Cadia the planet was gone. Cadia the symbol endured, the reminder of what the Imperium's defenders were willing to sacrifice, and the warning of what the Black Legion was capable of destroying. Abaddon's 13th Black Crusade was not a failure. It was the most successful military operation any enemy had conducted against the Imperium in 10,000 years. The destruction of Cadia, the creation of the Great Rift, the division of the Imperium into two halves that could not effectively communicate or coordinate. These were not the results of a failed invasion. They were the results of a 10,000-year plan executed to completion. The despoiler had achieved what the Warmaster could not the conquest of the Imperium. Conquest was not the objective. The wounding, the crippling, the infliction of damage so severe that the Imperium's continued existence was no longer assured. Horus had tried to kill the Imperium quickly. Abaddon was killing it slowly. The patience of 10,000 years. The plan of 12 preliminary crusades. The culmination of a strategy whose scope exceeded anything the Imperium's analysts had attributed to the being they had dismissed as a recurring nuisance. Abaddon the Despoiler. The son who surpassed his father's legacy by destroying the thing his father had tried to conquer. The galaxy is burning. As the words prescribe, the Black Legion in the Era Indomitus is the most powerful chaos force the galaxy has ever contained, and the power is Abaddon's achievement. The 13th Black Crusade did not end with Cadia's fall. The destruction of the fortress world and the creation of the Great Rift were not the culmination of Abaddon's plan, but the completion of its first phase. The rift divided the galaxy. The Imperium was severed into two halves that could not effectively communicate or coordinate. The strategic conditions that the rift produced, the isolation, the disruption, the progressive degradation of the Imperium's institutional infrastructure, were the conditions Abaddon had been working toward for 10,000 years. The second phase is underway. The Black Legion's operations since Cadia's fall have been directed at the exploitation of the conditions the rift produced. The isolated worlds, the severed supply lines, the Imperial forces that are fighting alone against threats they cannot address without the coordination the rift has destroyed. Abaddon's forces are active across both halves of the divided galaxy, striking where the Imperium is weakest, exploiting the vulnerabilities that the rift has created. Vigilus was the test case. The strategically critical world, positioned at one of the few stable routes connecting the two halves of the Imperium, was targeted by the Black Legion's forces in an operation that demonstrated the Despoiler's post-Cadia capability. The Vigilus campaign brought the Black Legion into direct conflict with the Imperium's most capable defenders, and the conflict's outcome, contested, costly, inconclusive, demonstrated that the Black Legion's capability has not diminished since Cadia. The Black Legion numbers in the tens of thousands of Chaos Space Marines, a force that exceeds the strength of most traitor legions and that rivals some of the Imperium's larger chapters. The force's composition reflects Abaddon's vision for the Black Legion as a multi-origin coalition rather than a single lineage formation. Warriors from every traitor legion serve in the Black Legion's ranks, alongside warbands of renegade space marines from chapters that have turned since the heresy. The Black Legion is not a Sons of Horus successor. It is a new force, built from the remnants of the old legions and the recruits of the subsequent millennia. The diversity is deliberate. Abaddon's dissolution of the Sons of Horus was not simply the termination of a failed identity. It was the opening of the Black Legion to warriors who would not have served the Sons of Horus, warriors whose original Legion identities would have prevented them from subordinating themselves to the XY Legion's name. The Black Legion carries no Legion's name. It carries Abaddon's, and the carrying is the invitation: join not a legion but a war, not a lineage but a purpose, not a dead Primarch's memory but a living commander's ambition. The invitation has been accepted by warriors across the traitor spectrum. World eaters who have retained enough sanity to function within a command structure. Thousand Sons sorcerers whose capabilities Abaddon values even as the sorcery's source makes him cautious. Night Lords whose predatory inclinations the Black Legion's campaigns can accommodate. The Black Legion is the Eye of Terror's melting pot, the force where the old identities are subordinated to the new purpose, where the origin matters less than the commitment. Guilliman's return has created a dynamic that Abaddon's 10,000-year plan did not anticipate. The resurrection of a loyal Primarch, the return of Robert Guilliman from stasis, the launch of the Indomitus Crusade, the reorganization of the Imperium's military capability under a being whose strategic intelligence approaches the Emperor's, has produced a response that the Imperium's previous defenses could not generate. The Imperium, under Guilliman's leadership, is fighting back in a way it has not fought back for millennia. Abaddon regards Guilliman with the respect that one master strategist brings to the assessment of another, and the respect does not translate into hesitation. The Long War has survived challenges before. The Imperium's temporary resurgences, the periods of recovery that follow its most devastating crises, are features of the conflict's rhythm that Abaddon's experience has taught him to accommodate. Guilliman's return is a resurgence. The resurgence will be addressed. The Long War will continue. The Black Legion's operations continue, in the Eye of Terror and beyond it, in the real space territories that the Rift has made accessible, and in the warp-adjacent regions that the Rift's expansion has created. The Black Legion prosecutes the Long War with the persistence that 10,000 years of fighting have produced. The persistence is not hope. It is not faith. It is will. The cold, enduring Chthonian will that Abaddon inherited from his Primarch, and that the Primarch inherited from the gangs, and that the gangs inherited from the tunnels of a world whose sole lesson was that the being who stops fighting is the being who loses. The Black Legion does not stop fighting. It has not stopped fighting for 10,000 years. It will not stop fighting for the next 10,000. Because the Long War's objectives, the destruction of the Imperium, the answering of the Emperor's failure, are objectives that do not have an expiration date. Let the galaxy burn. The burning continues. The warrior lodges are the heresy's most effective weapon, and the weapon was not designed by the Chaos Gods. It was designed by the Word Bearers. Lorga's vengeance against the Emperor, the Word-Bearer's Primarch's response to the Emperor's censure at Monarchia, the humiliation that had turned Lorga from the most devoted of sons into the Imperium's most patient enemy, was not expressed through open rebellion. It was expressed through infiltration. Through the patient, methodical corruption of the institutions that the Imperium's military depended on, using mechanisms that the institutions' cultures could not recognize as threats, because the mechanisms looked like natural features of the cultures they were being introduced into. The warrior lodges were inspired by the totem animal cults of Davin, the same world where Horus would later be corrupted. The Word-Bearers, who had brought Davin into compliance alongside the Lunar Wolves during the Great Crusade, had studied the Davinite cults and recognized in their structure a mechanism that could be used to subvert the legions from within. The lodges were fraternal organizations. secret societies within the legions, open to warriors of all ranks, operating outside the formal command structure, providing a space for social interaction and fellowship that the legion's military hierarchy did not offer. Membership was voluntary, meetings were private. The lodge's discussions were not reported to the legion's command. The lodge existed alongside the formal structure, not in opposition to it, not as a rival authority, but as a complement, a social mechanism that filled a gap the military structure left open. The gap was real. The legion's formal hierarchies were rigid, rank-based, oriented toward the prosecution of military operations. They did not provide the kind of informal social interaction that sentient beings, even transhuman ones, need. The warrior lodges offered this. A place where a captain and a line warrior could interact as equals, where rank was set aside and brotherhood was expressed through the shared identity of lodge membership. This sounds benign. It was designed to sound benign. The warrior lodge's benign appearance was the mechanism's most important feature, because the mechanism's purpose was not fellowship. It was the creation of alternative loyalty networks within the legions, networks that operated outside the formal command structure, that were not visible to the legion's leadership, that could be used to identify sympathetic warriors and cultivate their loyalty toward the lodge rather than the legion. The lodges were Erebus's tool, the word-bearer's first chaplain, the agent whose manipulation of Horus on Davin was the heresy's triggering event, used the lodges as the infrastructure through which the corruption spread. Lodge members who were sympathetic to the rebellion were identified and cultivated. Lodge members who were resistant were excluded, marginalized, reported to the lodge's leadership for monitoring. The lodge's social function, the fellowship, the equality, the brotherhood, was the cover for the intelligence operation that the lodge was actually conducting. Within the Sons of Horus, the warrior lodge was the mechanism by which Horus's post-Davin corruption was transmitted from the Primarchs' inner circle to the legion's broader officer corps. The lodge identified the officers who would follow Horus into treachery and separated them from the officers who would not. The separation was invisible, conducted through the lodge's social dynamics rather than through the formal command structure, using the bonds of fellowship and shared identity that the lodge provided to sort the loyal from the disloyal, without the sorting being visible to anyone outside the lodge. Loken recognized the danger. The phlegmatic member of the Mornival, the outsider whose perspective allowed him to see what the insider's familiarity concealed, Loken saw the warrior lodge for what it was. A mechanism of control operating outside the legion's formal governance, providing an alternative authority structure that could be used to direct the legion's warriors in ways the formal structure did not sanction. Torgadon had been a lodge member, the sanguine member of the Mornival, the conscience, the warrior whose humor and directness made him one of the legion's most respected voices. Torgadon had joined the lodge before the corruption began, when the lodge was or appeared to be the benign fellowship it claimed to be. He quit when the lodge's true nature became apparent, when the lodge proposed making Loken the scapegoat for an incident on Davin that threatened to expose the corruption's early stages. The quitting was the break. Torgadon and Loken on one side of the Mornival, Abaddon and Aximand on the other. The sanguine and the phlegmatic against the choleric and the melancholic. The advisory body that was supposed to balance the Primarch's decision-making was now divided along the same line that the lodge had drawn through the entire legion. The Lodge's effectiveness is the heresy's most disturbing lesson for the Imperium that survived it. The mechanism that corrupted the Sons of Horus was not alien. It was not supernatural. It was social, a fraternal organization, a secret society, a mechanism that exploited the gap between the military hierarchy's formal authority and the warriors' informal social needs. The lodges could be replicated in any military organization. They could be operating now in the 41st millennium inside the Astartes chapters or the Imperial Guard regiments, using the same mechanism of informal fellowship and alternative loyalty to identify and cultivate sympathetic individuals. The Imperium knows this. The Inquisition hunts for the Lodge's contemporary equivalents with a dedication that the Lodge's historical effectiveness justifies. Every secret society within the Imperium's military, every informal gathering, every unofficial fraternal organization, every social mechanism that operates outside the formal command structure is examined by the Ordo Hereticus, with the awareness that the mechanism that destroyed the Emperor's finest legion could destroy the Imperium's current military with the same effectiveness. The Lodges remain the most elegant weapon the forces of chaos have ever employed. Not a daemon, not a sorceress working. A social mechanism that turned the warrior's own need for fellowship into the instrument of their corruption. The Sons of Horus did not fall to chaos in the way that the word-bearers fell, through theological conversion, through the conscious embrace of the ruinous powers' worship. The Sons of Horus fell through the gradual, invisible, socially mediated process that the Lodges facilitated. The corruption was not imposed from outside. It was grown from inside, using the Legion's own culture as the medium. This is why the Sons of Horus's fall is the heresy's most terrifying example. Not because the Sons of Horus were the most powerful legion. Because the Sons of Horus's fall could happen to anyone. The mechanism that corrupted them is a mechanism that exists in every military organization, in every institution that produces the combination of hierarchy and informal social interaction that the Lodges exploited. The Sons of Horus's fall is not a warning about the dangers of chaos. It is a warning about the dangers of trust. Abaddon's relationship with the Chaos Gods is the Black Legion's most significant deviation from Horus's legacy, and the deviation is deliberate. Horus served the Chaos Gods. By the time the Warmaster stood on the Vengeful Spirit's bridge with the Emperor's fury bearing down on him, Horus was the Chaos Gods' vessel, not their servant in the political sense, not a vassal whose allegiance was contingent and whose obedience was voluntary. Their vessel, a container for their combined power, an instrument through which the ruinous powers expressed their will, a being whose original identity had been consumed by the entities whose power he carried. Horus lost himself. This is the lesson that Abaddon extracted from the Warmaster's fall, and the lesson is the foundation of the Despoiler's approach to the ruinous powers. Abaddon will not be consumed. This is not defiance, it is not the rejection of chaos that a loyalist would practice. Abaddon uses chaos. He draws on the ruinous powers' strength. He accepts their gifts, the daemon sword Drachnian, the dark blessings that enhance his already formidable capability, the daemonic allies whose support makes the Black Crusades possible. But Abaddon does not surrender to any single Chaos God. The distinction matters. The Chaos Gods are competitive. Each seeks to dominate the others, to claim the largest share of the galaxy's psychic emissions, to elevate its champions above the champions of its rivals. A warrior who pledges allegiance to a single chaos god, who accepts Khorne's fury or Tzeentch's sorcery, or Nurgle's resilience or Slaanesh's excess, receives that god's patronage and that god's attention. The patronage is powerful. The attention is consuming. Abaddon pledges to none. He receives the gifts of all four without committing to any one, maintaining the independence that Horus lost, the capacity to direct his own will, to pursue his own objectives, to wage the long war for his own purposes rather than for the purposes the Chaos Gods would impose on him. This is either the most disciplined act of will in the history of Chaos-adjacent warriors, or the most arrogant. The Chaos Gods do not offer their gifts freely. The gifts come with expectations, implicit, corrupting, increasingly insistent expectations that the recipient will serve the giver's purposes. A warrior who accepts gifts from all four gods while serving none is a warrior who is playing four hands of a game simultaneously, keeping each patron satisfied enough to continue providing support while never allowing any patron enough influence to dominate. The game has been running for 10,000 years. Abaddon has been playing it since the heresy's end, since the exile, since the return and the destruction of the clone and the creation of the Black Legion. For 10,000 years, the Despoiler has maintained the balance, accepting Chaos's power while rejecting Chaos's control, using the ruinous powers as tools while refusing to become a tool himself. Whether the balance is sustainable, whether a being can interact with the Chaos Gods for 10 millennia without eventually being consumed by the interaction, is the question that the Black Legion's future depends on. The historical record is not encouraging. Every other champion who has attempted the balance has eventually fallen to one god or another, the accumulated weight of the gifts producing a dependence that the champion's will could not resist. Abaddon has not fallen 10,000 years, and the Despoiler remains Abaddon, not the daemon prince of any particular god, not the ascending champion whose apotheosis would complete the ruinous power's claim on him. Abaddon undivided, the Warmaster of Chaos who is Warmaster of himself. Horus fell because he surrendered. He allowed the Chaos God's power to flow through him without restriction, and the flowing consumed the vessel. Abaddon has learned from his father's failure. The son will not make the father's mistake. The power will be used. The power will not be permitted to use him. This is Abaddon's most significant achievement, and it is an achievement that the Imperium does not fully appreciate. The Imperium regards Abaddon as another Chaos warlord, a particularly powerful one, a particularly persistent one, but fundamentally the same kind of threat that the Imperium's institutions have been addressing for 10 millennia. The Imperium does not understand that Abaddon's independence from the Chaos Gods makes him more dangerous than a dedicated servant of any single god would be, because the independence means that Abaddon's objectives are not predictable. A servant of Khorne will seek bloodshed. A servant of Tzeentch will pursue schemes. A servant of Nurgle will spread plague. A servant of Slaanesh will seek sensation. The patterns are recognizable, the motivations are understood, and the Imperium's response can be calibrated to the pattern. Abaddon has no pattern. His objectives are his own. His strategy serves his own purposes. The Imperium cannot predict what the Despoiler will do next, because the Despoiler's decisions are not made by the Chaos Gods. They are made by Abaddon. The galaxy's most dangerous Chaos warlord is the one who is not a servant of Chaos. the warrior who uses the gods without being used by them, the son who watched his father be consumed, and who decided that the consumption would not be his fate. Horus was the Chaos God's greatest weapon. Abaddon is his own. The Eye of Horus is the galaxy's most feared symbol, and the fear it produces has outlasted the being it was named for by 10,000 years. A staring eye, rendered in the glaring geometry that the Xvi Legion adopted when it renamed itself from the Lunar Wolves to the Sons of Horus. The symbol replaced the wolf's head that the Lunar Wolves had carried since their conquest of Luna, the lupine emblem that had represented the Legion's predatory character throughout the Great Crusade. The Eye of Horus was not a wolf. It was something else, a staring, unblinking symbol of awareness that carried the weight of the Warmaster's gaze, the consciousness of a being who saw everything and who directed his legion's violence with the precision that the seeing provided. The Eye of Horus has survived the Warmaster's death, the Sons of Horus's dissolution, and the Black Legion's creation. It persists as the symbol of the Despoiler's forces, modified, incorporated into the Black Legion's iconography, but fundamentally the same symbol that the Sons of Horus painted on their sea green armor when the renaming occurred. The Eye watches. The Eye has been watching for 10,000 years. On the worlds that the Black Legion has struck, the worlds whose populations have experienced the 13th Black Crusade's violence, the worlds that have been raided by Black Legion forces during the Long War's 10 millennium duration. The Eye is the herald of destruction, painted on the hulls of warships that emerge from the warp, carved into the surfaces of worlds that the Black Legion has conquered, branded on the buildings and the monuments and the bodies of the populations that the Black Legion has subjugated. The Eye is fear's symbol. Not because it represents military capability, the galaxy contains many forces whose military capability exceeds individual Black Legion warbands. Because it represents the quality of malice that the Black Legion embodies. The concentrated, patient, 10,000-year hatred of a force that has been fighting the same war since the Imperium's founding, and that has not weakened, and that has not relented, and that has not abandoned the purpose for which the war is being fought. The Imperial citizens who see the Eye know what it means. It means that the beings who destroyed Cadia are here. It means that the galaxy's oldest and most persistent enemy has arrived. And the arrival is not the beginning of a negotiation, or a temporary incursion, or a raid that will end when the raiding force has taken what it wants. The Eye means war. Total, committed, purposeful war, conducted by warriors whose patience exceeds any mortal lifespan, and whose fury has been accumulating for 10 millennia. The symbol's persistence is evidence of the Sons of Horus's enduring influence on the galaxy's cultural landscape. Horus is dead. The Sons of Horus are dissolved. But the icon they created, the staring, watching, judging eye that the Warmaster chose to represent his legion, survives. The symbol has outlasted the being and the force and the purpose it was created to represent. And the outlasting is the measure of the mark the Sons of Horus left on the galaxy. The mark is permanent. 10,000 years of the Imperium's attempts to suppress the name, to erase the memory, to delete the record of the heresy's architect from the histories, and the Eye still stares. From the hulls of warships, from the armor of chaos warriors, from the nightmares of the citizens who have seen it. The Eye does not close, the Eye does not look away. 10,000 years of watching, and the watching has not ended, because the being the Eye was named for may be dead, but the force the Eye represents is alive, in the Black Legion, in the long war, in the galaxy that the being's betrayal reshaped. Horus is dead. The Eye of Horus is not. The Eye watches the galaxy it helped to burn. And the galaxy, when it sees the Eye, remembers what the Eye represents. The favored son who became the greatest traitor. The legion that was the best and became the worst. The betrayal that broke the Imperium and that the Imperium has been carrying for 10,000 years. The Eye remembers. The galaxy remembers. Neither will forget. The Sons of Horus are the Imperium's cautionary tale, and the caution has not been sufficient. The tale says, do not build your civilization around a single point of failure. The lunar wolves were built around Horus. The Chthonian loyalty that defined the Legion, the personal, absolute, unconditional devotion to the Primarch that made the lunar wolves the Imperium's most effective fighting force, was the same loyalty that made the Legion's betrayal inevitable when the Primarch turned. The same quality that made them the best, made them the worst. The strength was the weakness. The loyalty that conquered galaxies was the loyalty that burned them. The Imperium should have learnt this. The 10,000 years since the heresy should have produced institutions that do not depend on individuals. Governance that functions without the personality of a single leader. Military structures that are resilient to the corruption of their commanders. The Imperium has had 10,000 years to build the kind of civilization that cannot be turned by the turning of one man. The Imperium has not built this civilization. The Imperium's military depends on its chapter masters and its generals. The Imperium's governance depends on its planetary governors and its sector commanders. The Imperium's spiritual authority depends on the Emperor, a single individual seated on a single throne, sustaining a single beacon, the failure of any component of which would produce a catastrophe that would exceed the heresy. The Imperium is built around a single point of failure, the same architecture that the lunar wolves were built around, the same vulnerability that the Sons of Horus demonstrated when the single point failed. The Emperor is the Imperium's Horus. The Golden Throne is the Imperium's Chthonian loyalty. The Astronomicon is the Imperium's combat doctrine. The thing that makes the civilization function, the absence of which would cause the civilization to collapse. The Imperium has replicated the Sons of Horus's structural weakness at the civilizational level, and the replication is not accidental. It is the product of the same impulse that produced the lunar wolves' loyalty to Horus. The need for a single, visible, unquestioned authority around which the civilization's identity can be constructed. The Sons of Horus demonstrate what happens when that authority fails. The Imperium has been watching the demonstration for 10,000 years and has not changed the underlying structure that makes the demonstration relevant. The lesson extends beyond the structural. The Sons of Horus's fall was not simply the failure of a legion's command structure. It was the failure of a culture, the Chthonian culture of personal loyalty, the culture that valued the bond between the warrior and his leader above the bond between the warrior and his civilization. When the culture's highest value, loyalty to the Primarch, was directed toward a Primarch who had been corrupted, the culture produced the logical outcome of its own values. The warriors followed their leader. The leader led them into treason. The culture that made the following possible was the culture that made the treason inevitable. The Imperium's culture is the Sons of Horus's culture at scale. The devotion to the Emperor, the theological, unquestioning, absolute devotion that the ecclesiarchy maintains, and that the Imperium's population is conditioned to feel. is the same devotion that the lunar wolves felt for Horus. The devotion is the culture's strength, because it provides the unity that a galaxy-spanning civilization requires. The devotion is the culture's weakness, because it depends on the object of the devotion being worthy of it, and the worthiness cannot be verified by the beings whose devotion prevents them from questioning it. The Sons of Horus's warriors did not question Horus. The Imperium's citizens do not question the Emperor. The parallel is exact, and the exactness is the warning. The warning will not be heeded. The Imperium cannot heed it, because heeding it would require questioning the Emperor, and the questioning is heresy, and the heresy is punishable by death. And the system that punishes the questioning is the system that the questioning is supposed to address. The Sons of Horus demonstrated the catastrophe that personal loyalty produces when the person is unworthy of the loyalty. The Imperium has built its entire civilization on the assumption that the person at its center is worthy. The assumption may be correct. The Emperor may be worthy. But the assumption is untestable, because the system does not permit the testing. And an untestable assumption is not an assumption. It is a faith. And the distinction between faith and the kind of unquestioning loyalty that destroyed the Sons of Horus is not a distinction the Imperium is equipped to draw. The Sons of Horus fell because they could not question their Primarch. The Imperium endures because it cannot question its Emperor. The same mechanism, the same vulnerability, different outcomes, so far. The Sons of Horus still exist, not as a legion, not as the force that Abaddon dissolved when he created the Black Legion, but as warbands, small, scattered, defiant fragments of the XVI Legion that refused the dissolution, that maintained the Sons of Horus's identity in the face of Abaddon's decree that the identity was dead. These warbands are called the thrice-cursed traitors. The name captures their position precisely. Cursed once by the Emperor for the betrayal of the heresy, cursed a second time by the galaxy's other forces for the wars they have fought in the 10 millennia since, and cursed a third time by Abaddon himself for their refusal to accept the Black Legion's identity. The thrice cursed are hunted by the Black Legion as aggressively as they are hunted by the Imperium. Abaddon does not tolerate the persistence of the Sons of Horus's name. The name is the thing the despoiler destroyed, the leash that tied the Legion to a dead Primarch, the identity that produced the mourning and the stagnation that the Black Legion was created to overcome. Warriors who continue to use the name are warriors who reject the despoiler's authority, and the rejection is answered with the violence that Abaddon brings to all rejections. The thrice-cursed fight anyway. They maintain the sea-green armor. They bear the Eye of Horus. They carry the dead Warmaster's legacy into the battles of the 41st millennium, with a defiance that is either loyalty or delusion, depending on whether you believe the being they are loyal to deserved the loyalty. Some of the thrice-cursed have degenerated. The Eye of Terror's corrupting influence, applied across 10 millennia without the discipline that the Black Legion provides, has turned some Sons of Horus warbands into chaos worshippers, whose connection to the XVI Legion's original character has been consumed by the warp's transformative influence. These warbands fight for chaos rather than for Horus. They use the Sons of Horus's name as a banner rather than an identity. Others have not degenerated. Some thrice-cursed warbands maintain a discipline that recalls the Lunar Wolves' Great Crusade era professionalism. The throat strike doctrine, the precise application of force at the critical point, the tactical pragmatism that Horus's training produced in the warriors he commanded. These warbands fight the long war in the manner their Primarch taught them, and the fighting is effective. And the effectiveness is the evidence that the culture Horus built survives, even though the being who built it does not. The existence of the thrice cursed raises the question of whether Abaddon was right to dissolve the Sons of Horus. The despoiler's logic was sound. The name was a leash. The identity was a prison. The Legion's worship of a dead Primarch was preventing the warriors from becoming what the Long War required. But the dissolution destroyed something that the Black Legion does not replicate: the connection to the Xi Legion's original identity, the lineage that stretched back to the Lunar Wolves and to Chthoniya, and to the Great Crusade, and to the being who had been the Emperor's most trusted son. The Black Legion is Abaddon's creation. The Sons of Horus were Horus's. The distinction matters because the two creations serve different purposes and carry different meanings. And the meaning of the Sons of Horus, the meaning of a legion that fell from the highest height and that carries the name of the fall, is a meaning the Black Legion's purpose does not encompass. The Black Legion fights the Long War. The Sons of Horus carry the memory of why the Long War started. The two functions are different, and the galaxy's narrative requires both. The thrice cursed persist, in the Eye of Terror's depths, in the real space regions where the Black Legion's authority does not reach, in the margins and the shadows where the galaxy's most hunted warriors find the space to exist. They persist because the Xi Legion's identity is not something a decree can eliminate. The identity is embedded in the warriors who carry it, in their gene seed, their training, their cultural inheritance, the Chthonian loyalty that Horus cultivated and that 10,000 years of exile have not erased. The Sons of Horus are alive, damaged, diminished, hunted by everyone. But alive, the Xi Legion endures. The name Horus is the heaviest word in the Imperial lexicon. It is not spoken lightly. On most worlds of the Imperium, the name is not spoken at all, classified as a blasphemy so severe that the utterance itself constitutes a crime punishable by the Inquisition's attention. The name is scrubbed from records, removed from histories, deleted from the official accounts of the era it belongs to, as though the deletion of the name could delete the events the name produced. It cannot. The heresy happened. The name that triggered it is engraved in the galaxy's fundamental condition, in the great rift that divided the Imperium, in the golden throne that sustains the Emperor, in the Eye of Terror from which the Black Legion emerges to wage the wars the name's bearer started. The galaxy is shaped by the name. The name is the reason the galaxy is what it is. The Sons of Horus carried that name. They bore it on their armor and in their gene seed and in the culture that their Primarch had built from the gang lord traditions of Chthoniya and the military genius of the Great Crusade. They were the Xi Legion. They were the Lunar Wolves. They were the Sons of Horus. They were the Black Legion, and the Black Legion is the consequence of the Sons of Horus, and the Sons of Horus are the consequence of the Lunar Wolves. And the Lunar Wolves are the consequence of a Primarch who landed on a gang world near Terra, and who grew into the being the Emperor trusted most, and who betrayed the trust with a completeness that 10,000 years have not been able to repair. The chain is unbroken, from Chthoniya to Terra, from the Lunar Wolves to the Sons of Horus to the Black Legion. from the Emperor's most trusted son to the Imperium's most hated enemy. Every link in the chain is connected to the link before it and the link after it. And the chain's weight is the weight of everything the heresy produced. The trillions of dead, the worlds destroyed, the civilization crippled, the Emperor entombed, the galaxy divided. Horus started it. The Sons of Horus carried it. Abaddon inherited it. The Imperium endures it. And somewhere in the Eye of Terror, a warrior in sea green armor still fights. Not for the Black Legion, not for Abaddon's long war. For the thing the sea green represents, the memory of a Primarch who was the best of them before he was the worst. The memory of a legion that was the finest before it was the most damned. The memory of the height from which the fall began. The height that the galaxy has not reached since, and that the falling has ensured it may never reach again. The warrior does not know whether Horus deserved the loyalty that destroyed the galaxy. The warrior cannot know, because the knowing would require a judgment that the Chthonian culture does not permit, the judgment that says the boss was wrong, that the loyalty was misplaced, that the following was the error that produced the catastrophe. The warrior follows, as the lunar wolves followed, as the Sons of Horus followed, as the Black Legion follows. The following is the culture's deepest instinct, and the instinct does not yield to the evidence, because the instinct is the thing the evidence is supposed to override, and the overriding is the thing the culture was built to prevent. The lunar wolves followed the Emperor. The Sons of Horus followed Horus. The Black Legion follows Abaddon. The pattern is the same. The mechanism is the same. The vulnerability is the same. The only thing that changes is the name at the top. And the name at the top determines whether the following builds an empire or burns one. Horus Lupercal, the Warmaster, the favored son, the being who carried the Emperor's trust to the place where trust dies, and who left it there, and who built a rebellion from the ashes of the trust, and who fought the rebellion to its conclusion on the bridge of the vengeful spirit, and who died there, destroyed by the father he had betrayed, erased so completely that even the chaos gods could not bring him back. The name is heavy. The name is forbidden. The name is the heaviest word in the imperial lexicon, and the word is written in the sky, in the great rift's burning light, in the Eye of Terror's ancient wound, in the 10,000 years of suffering that the name's bearer produced. The Sons of Horus are gone. The lunar wolves are gone. The Primarch who gave both names their meaning is gone. What remains is the consequence. The long war. The Black Legion. The galaxy that was broken by the being who was supposed to protect it. Let the galaxy burn. The galaxy is burning. It has been burning for 10,000 years. And the fire was lit by the hand that once held the Emperor's trust.